video look distinctly different this time. Your color balance and everything's very I don't know, it's oversaturated. It's what your video kind of looks like.
Oh no, he looks like a white man. He's much paler.
Well, I was actually like looking at in his cap, it's just solid black. You see no textures, things like that. But I certainly do appreciate getting the cheapest webcam and sticking it on top of your desktop, because that was the same strategy I used.
I should have bought a Russian one.
A Russian.
Just this Western stuff, it's just no good. It's like I bought a Russian shortwave radio 50 years ago. It was a wonderful piece of junk. Selena was the brand, that was right, yes. Quite very amusing. It weighed a ton.
Well, a guy I worked with at one time was from India, and he said, they very much liked the West, but they imported lots of their technology from Russia. And it's like India wanted to get into the textile manufacturing. And the West, he said, had all this wonderful computer-controlled machinery and whatnot. And they they got this Russian equipment because, it could be human powered if it had to be. You could crank it and use treadles and sew and weave and whatnot. And they had plenty of people, but very unreliable electricity, no computer repair people. So
okay.
So
Anyway,
they went with Russian stuff because it was indestructible mechanical.
Last week we're doing Sophrosune. Now at the end of end of paragraph 2, we have pseudophilia. That sounds pretty exciting. I want to get into that.
Well, I think it means love of falsehood. I think you were confusing it with, some other vice you cultivated, but
yeah, I don't know. I'm, just a little ape man, and I have my limitations. I'm well aware of that. I have relatively practiced a certain degree of truthfulness throughout my life.
And people
I note the love of lies. It's fascinating. The love of falsehood. People just want to hear what pleases them.
And as they get older, they don't want to hear anything at all.
Well, okay, now Donald's pseudophilia is the soup of the day. Okay, you can span out from that one on any subject. Donald, give us an example of pseudophilia, and we'll be happy.
This is
bringing you back. I'm doing Sharon's thing. I'm bringing you back to the text. Just think Judaism.
Well, pseudophilia is the opposite of
they survived
philosophia, the love of wisdom.
Most of the Jews survived thousands of years via devotion to the text. And we have to learn the same.
Well, that I do have thoughts on that. Philosophy is not primarily textual. It's not, as Wittgenstein would have us, collecting true statements or something, to determine what is the case, because human language doesn't support that kind of project. that
Well,
you
in
need
philosophy,
to learn to recognize, you know, I mean, Kenneth, and here's one of the things I had actually not heard him say so much, is that it's being that's the source of truth, and being able, regardless of the words used, to point to the world, to some phenomena or behavior that can be observed directly. I mean, the Platonic dialogues, I wouldn't say they're full of it, but there's plenty of times when in one dialogue somebody hears Socrates make a certain argument. Then in another dialogue, the same topic comes around. The person that heard Socrates make an argument starts feeding it back to him, knowing they'll get the right answer, and surprise, surprise, Socrates gives them a second anal orifice, you know, for their trouble. And
okay, now look,
you know, and that's because it's not knowing the words.
Let's get the question right. Philosophy is a moral question.
I
The
think it is.
sophists would use knowledge for the outcome. They don't care. They don't care about the purity of knowledge.
That's true. So
They're
far,
interested in the outcome. Now, the thing with philosophy is about being the purity of your moral ambition in gaining knowledge. That you're there to know for the sake of knowing, rather than simply using knowledge to advance your own cause.
well, not precisely, because it is what is the underpinnings for Sophrosune also, to become self-provident, is a kind of knowledge. It's that knowledge you get from knowing yourself. And it's also why Socrates says, I quit studying natural science, because as much as it told me about the stars and the planets and what, to the extent that they knew them, it didn't help him with how should I behave? What should I do? How do I treat myself? How do I treat others?
Well, actually, I think Socrates was just trying a new line of business, because the naturalist field was saturated. You got to sell the public something new.
Yeah, they told him the sun was a large rock that was on fire, and that pretty well ripped it for him.
So we live now, anyways. We're getting to pseudophilia. We're living in a culture with a love of fakeness.
Why don't we let Rick? Why don't we let
celebrities? Your celebrities are your gods. Now, in better times, the good Christians looked upon actors as a class not to be admired. But today, they're the gods.
Hi.
Well, Rick, please, thank you.
Howdy.
And to Steve, what I like about this meeting is I benefit from it, and I don't have to do anything for that. It's like money for nothing. You know.
You really believe that, Donald? Then you're a lost soul.
He doesn't really believe it. He's just saying it.
But
so you know, Stephen, I think you're right that pseudophilia is going to be the underlying theme of this paragraph, in the same way that the paragraph we talked about last week, Sophrosune, was the underlying theme. And for those who weren't here last week, you can follow the link and scroll down to section H, Sophism and Corruption, and read that first paragraph. Or, in the interest of expediting, here's the paragraph this is the first paragraph of section H. We talked about it the last 2.5 months, really. We were talking about Sophrosune and what is it and how does it work. It's a complicated subject. And the issue is that modern English doesn't have any equivalent to that term. And there's no one word, there's no one phrase. It sort of takes a book to translate that word, as the entire Greek worldview is encapsulated in it. And it is the foundation stone for their entire moral system, their epistemological system for deciding how you know things and what don't you know. How do you decide what kind of life to have? How should politics be organized? I mean, all these things come from Sophros Sune. And so it's unfortunate that in the modern world, in modern English, it's a lacuna in our perception of the world. It's a blank spot. We don't have words for it. We don't talk about it. We can't think about it easily because all the words that we try to use that are nearby actually mean something else. And so as we try to reach, we sort of slip back into our modernist kind of preconceptions. It was a lot of work. Pseudophilia, on the other hand, won't be so hard. we're well acquainted with pseudophilia, both in ourselves and others. We see it all the goddamn time, and we'll talk about this. So in general, just a recap for those who haven't been here. This book, Millennia and Microcosm by philosopher Kenneth Smith, is a book that it's based on the precept that different epochs of history have different worldviews that they take for granted. And by taking for granted, I mean they're really committed to them without fully appreciating what they've signed up for. It's like the social contract that we learn in political science, except that nobody ever handed you a piece of paper and let you read it to see what you were agreeing to. But in this case, it's not a social contract, it's a epistemological, moral, value-based, axiological contract. What are you going to consider important? What are you going to notice or not notice in yourself and the world around you? How are you going to make decisions about what's true or false? All of this stuff is based on this missing term that we don't have a word for. So that part is hard to pin down, but the basics of pseudophilia we can pin down. We'll do that in our first hour here. And then what's going to take a little longer is to see why, from the ancient worldview's perspective, pseudophilia was considered a red flag to ban you from getting involved in politics. In the modern world, we sort of hold up democracy, one man, one vote as the ideal, and say everybody should get a say. But the Greeks didn't believe that. Now, the Greeks could be wrong about all kinds of stuff here, but our purpose here isn't to say we're right and they're wrong, and it's not to say they're right and we're wrong. It's to learn to take on and off the modernist worldview and put on the ancient worldview and say, what would an ancient say about this? And then to do the reverse. Take the ancient back off, put the modern back on, say, well, what would a modern say about this? Because what he's trying to teach us to do in this book is to compare and contrast different worldviews. And we can only do that if we can learn not to always be trying to prove that what we think is right. That's the trap. The ideological idea that there is one single correct worldview, and by coincidence, we happen to have it. Yay, us. And that our job in nature is to run around and tell everybody that they're wrong and why they're wrong in excruciating detail. This is not a way to get free of your own preconceptions and biases. This is a way to entrap yourself harder, to pull the gate shut and lock it behind you and say, I can't get out. I don't want to get out. I'm in the right place. I see all things as unlike a god. I see things objectively as they truly are, and there's no errors in my thinking at all. This is the way most moderns go about they take for granted that you're supposed to trust yourself and that you mostly see things the way they are. The ancients had the opposite perspective. They said mostly we don't see things the way they are. The way things are is very complicated. We live in an infinite cosmos, right? It doesn't do any good to put a number to the size of the cosmos or the number of atoms in your body if you can't even count that high before you die. But we have no practical grasp on the level of complexity of these things that we're going up against. And so they said, the Greeks took for granted, as we've said in previous sessions, that mortals have both hands tied behind their back when it comes to the conflict of life. We can't see things the way they truly are. We can only approximate. And so if we're going to be smart, what we're going to do is to acknowledge right up front that everything in here is at least partially defective, and that the truth is out there, and that we got to hold this accountable based on that. And if we can't bring ourselves to do that, we're basically not a functioning adult from the ancient perspective. The modern perspective, you hit age 18, you're a functioning adult no matter how crazy you are. But in the ancient perspective, you might never be considered an adult if you can't get over your own ego and your need to call yourself all-seeing and all-knowing, which comes naturally to be. Ego comes naturally to us. So when he's talking about Sophros Sune, part of what he's talking about, we're not going to spend much time on Sophrosyne, but for those who missed it, it's important to say he's talking about a quality that a healthy species has, and that the individuals that make up that species have, but that Homo sapiens doesn't have particularly, and that it causes a great challenge for us. And we talked about the way the cheetah is obsessed with the sorts of things cheetahs should be concerned with. Can't stop looking at the beautiful, beautiful gazelle. The gazelle is so pretty. The cheetah wants to unite, even when the cheetah's full and it's taking a bath. It'll just look up and gaze longingly at the horizon, because gazelles are interesting to cheetahs. They're interested in the right things. That's Sophrosyne. They're focused on the things that are necessary for their species to be healthy. And the problem with Homo sapiens, we get to be a whole lot more creative and come up and inventive by breaking down that Sophrosyne through the process of evolution. And we're left with a species that can be enthusiastic about anything, not necessarily the things that are healthy for us. We could be enthusiastic about old Star Trek episodes. We can be enthusiastic about collecting Pokemon cards. We can be enthusiastic about purifying Germany and exterminating all people who are not of the proper race. I mean, we can be enthusiastic about anything. You can't get a cheetah to care about purifying its genetic pool. And it's not because it never heard of genes. It's because it has Sophrosyne, which orients it towards the things it should be focusing on to be healthy. We don't have that. So one of the consequences of a failure to have Sophrosyne, which is what he's talking about in paragraph 2, is it's very hard for people to govern themselves and each other, right? Governance is likely to attract people who have other motives than doing a great job of organizing humanity. It's likely to attract people, Duloy, he talks about in this paragraph, it's likely to attract people who want to serve their own appetites. I want to have gold toilets. I want to eat the finest steak. I want to have sex with all the pretty girls. And so I need to become king so that I can force people through the governance that I'm misusing to satisfy my appetites. The ancients believed a person like that should never be allowed anywhere near governance. They're basically not an adult. They're not no matter how old they are, they're not a functioning adult. They can't get out of their own parochial experiences and sensations. They're basically a prisoner of them. They're a slave to their own appetites and experiences. That's what a doulos is in the ancient Greek conception. A bonausos is someone who has liberated himself ostensibly from a life being directly driven by appetites and experiences, but now he's a different kind of prisoner. He's a prisoner of his logic and his math and his legal systems and the social networks that he's trying to climb. He's thinking systematically in an organized fashion, by which we mean those systems are thinking for him. He's ideological man. He's a prisoner of ideology. He's using Kierkegaard's definition of a delusion. And to ideological man, the world seems to make sense. He's got an answer for everything. His ideology tells him what the answer is. And his ideology is coincidentally the right one. Other people's ideologies are the wrong ones and they need to be corrected, but his ideology is the right one. And he wants to set out on the program to reorganize the entire world in his own image to fit his ideology. And you see this with the way the US legal system is put together. You see this with the way the US economy is put together. The idea that the only right way to value is money, and that money accounts for everything important. Nothing important is left out. And therefore it's okay if we have no other criteria for deciding what's important other than how much does it cost. This sort of thing. But it doesn't just show up in these venues, it also shows up in logic. Someone who thinks that everything has to be logically accountable, especially if they're stuck at first predicate logic. The simple logic we're taught in elementary school or first year college classes, then we're basically bringing a child's toy to bear on a world that's so complex that logic sometimes works and sometimes doesn't work. If logic always worked, no one would ever need to investigate reality. But the truth is that frequently reality violates our assumptions about how things are going to work. We have the wrong conditions that we begin reasoning from. And so with those wrong conditions, it doesn't matter how good our logic is, our conclusions are going to be bad too. This is how systemic thinking works. It tries to keep you rigidly following the rules on the assumption that you can only produce the truth. But the problem with it is, ultimately our systems are not gods, and reality doesn't dance to the tune of our systems. It's the other way around. If our system tells us that, well, the way to make Germany recover from World War I is to exterminate all people who aren't, pure-blooded Germans, reality isn't going to change to fit that. There's a clash between what's actually happening and what our system of thinking tells us. And when that clash happens, a sane response is to change our thinking. But the Banausos can't do that, because for the Banausos, the ideology thinks for them, and the ideology has an answer. And so the ideology must be right. And therefore, it's reality that has to be changed to the extent that they can pull it off. And it leads to catastrophes and crises. And it is a normal functioning of the human mind to do that for reasons that we've talked about. But it means that people who are stuck in that, let's call it the noetic side of the mind, Banausoi, who are stuck with noetic intellectual reasoning, have a tendency to perpetrate, catastrophes and holocausts and things like that the whole time, going, I'm just being logical, I'm just following the rules, you can't blame me, I'm just doing what I'm supposed to do, which is, what Himmler said. So it's what all of the killers say. It's like, it's not my fault. This is what Torquemada said. I had to torture him. If I don't save his eternal soul, he'll be tortured for eternity in hell. It doesn't matter how much I hurt his body. If I have a chance of saving his soul, that's infinitely important. I can't stop torturing these guys. I must do it. This is what Hannah Arendt says in The Origins of Totalitarianism. It is the logic that breeds fascism and Stalinism and Maoism and so on. The refusal to let the logic give up in the face of contradictory evidence. The insistence that we follow the logic to the bitter end no matter what, because it must be right. It has to be right. And of course, in that is buried the ego. So the thing is, the Greeks, especially by the late period, the ancient Greeks recognized both of these forms of thinking and being as half-witted, sort of aborted stages of human development. There is a third stage of human development that's supposed to happen, where you learn that although your experiences and feelings are important, they're not gods. They're not perfect. They don't get everything right. And although your logics and mathematics and rules and economies are important, they're also not gods, and they're not perfect, and they don't get everything right. And the only way to have an adult mind is to not let either of these faculties of the mind be your master. You have to master them. And the way you master them is you pit them against each other, and you pit reality against them both. So you end up with a dialectic in which, when one goes too far, the other two critique it and go, no, nope, that's wrong. Look, here's some facts that prove that that's wrong. Or, no, yeah, maybe the logic says that I should be out there setting up concentration camps and exterminating people, but I have a queasy feeling in my stomach, and I'm going to listen to that queasy feeling in my stomach, and that will force me to go out and get more information. And then I discover that, all of the Jews that I'm trying to exterminate are not abstract people who are destroying Germany, but actually they're each of them is an individual person with their own life and their own values, and everything that I thought about Jews was wrong, and this entire project of purification is broken. This ability to let reality in and to let emotions and experience in, this is what allows us to correct the extremes of banausic, overly hypernoetic intellectual reasoning to cut off catastrophes. And likewise, as any intellectual can tell you, the ability to bring logic to bear can help us to get our appetites under control, right? We can use, that's why intellectuals become intellectuals. Like, I don't have to poop myself. I can predict when I need to go to the bathroom. I can make a plan, and I can go there and take care of it. And my life is better because of my abstract planning and my distancing from my immediate experience of life. And of course, science at its best is based on the third proposition, which is, let us also bring reality into bear. And we'll check our feelings against reality. We'll check our theories against reality. We'll let reality be the ultimate arbiter. We'll live our life, as the Greeks said, kata phusin, according to nature. We'll let the cosmos critique our ideas and feelings. So what this section H is about, sophism and corruption, this is all of what I've been saying so far. I know we're almost a half hour in. All of this is just the setup to know what today's topic is. Our topic is, we're going through the what is this? This is 5, 6, 7. This is the 8th and final section of chapter 4, Ancient Civilizations, which in one chapter, Kenneth Smith tries to summarize the ancient worldview. and to get us to understand how different it is from the modern worldview. And we're at the end of it. We're in the last lettered section, H, which is called Sophism and Corruption. And this is about how and why did the ancient epoch's worldview collapse? Why did it fall apart? Why did they give up, their way of seeing the world? What led to that? So our first paragraph talked about sophrosune, the ability to know which way does health and vitality lie, to orient yourself towards it, and how hard it is for human beings to get that. The second paragraph, which I shared up above, which begins the ultimate stress, ... What we're going to talk about today is focusing on how it is that the Douloi and the Banausoi basically pulled apart ancient civilization and replaced it step by step, century by century, with what became medieval civilization. Why did that happen? What's the nature of that transformation? Why did the Aristoi let that happen? Why didn't they stop it? If it was their job to govern, how come they didn't pull it off? Why did all this occur? And in the course of that, we're going to be comparing and contrasting these three different kind of what he's referring to as caste worldviews, the Douloi, the Banausoi, and the Aristoi. That is, the people who live experientially and emotionally, the people who live intellectually and systematically, versus the actual adults who don't let either of those ways of thinking rule them because of the dangers involved. So let's go to questions first before we actually dive into today's stuff. Phil, you got your hand up. Come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
That's a good explanation for the Aristoi. But I was just wondering, like, whether that actually reaches the reality in a funny way. Let's take the two classes. The way I look at it is the relationship between being parochial and being cosmopolitan, right? The problem with being parochial is you're stuck in a certain structure and you believe it, and that could be way wrong, okay? But the problem with cosmopolitanism is that in a way, it has its faults too, because you have a diversity of systems, and it's like the ability to put on the right costume to meet those different needs. So who you are is not as important as who you could become in a stage play, so to speak, right? So therefore, in a sense, it's all based on much more diversity, a relativity of diversity. And for each particular situation, you say, oh, yes, I'll adopt this Spartan costume. For next one, you can say, oh, I'll adopt the Egyptian costume. And you are fitting the needs to a particular costume as if the costume makes you who you are instead of what you internally are. And the Aristoi, by balancing this, is still balancing, how should I say, a sort of a representation of something that's real, but it's not the real itself. I mean, it's sort of like appearances versus reality. Does it ever get there, or does it still just live in this equivocation between the two and the balancing of the two? And it's still sort of like I said, still underwater. As I said, like, okay, if the Aristoi is like, it's not sink to the bottom of the sea, he's rising to the top, he's only inches away from breaking the water. He could drown just as easily as being 20,000 leagues under the sea, right? So therefore, in a sense, you have to break through the water itself in order to breathe the clear air of reality. So I just wonder whether that balancing act, like I guess what they got is that the one side has the ability that, oh yeah, I'm underwater, I need a scuba gear, like that'll help. But is the scuba gear good enough, or does it just have a snorkel? I mean, and so I just wonder whether all three systems, even though, like, yeah, you're near enough to be able to see, oh yeah, I could begin to see the land, but I'm still drowning. So how does that work? I wonder because it's a balancing act of appearances rather than realities. So we call that actuality.
Yeah. You're
All
raising
right. So I just have a question. I mean, it's troubling. I could see in some sense it's even more frustrating to be only 3 inches away from breaking the water
Yeah.
than 20,000 leagues. Just life is what it is. It's like God's will. Like, what can I do? You're
Yeah.
you're 3 inches from breaking the water. You can't breathe, and it's actually more frustrating. You're so close. That's a question I have. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. It's a great question. So I want to, anybody who hasn't read Robert McKee's book Story, you probably should. I think you would really enjoy it. It's considered one of the screenwriting Bibles in Hollywood these days. And it's not a how-to book. He's talking about what is story, what is the nature of storytelling. And he goes back to Aristotle, which is why it's relevant to this. And he's talking about Aristotle's theory of storytelling. And as we know from our earlier discussions, Aristotle's theory of storytelling is based on Aristotle's theory of human character, human nature, the different, douloi, benounsoi, aristoi, sophrosune, all of these critical foundational issues are tied up in the way that Aristotle defines tragedy, for example, and how he characterizes it. And in the same way that Hegel built his whole career out of basically expanding Heraclitus, Robert McKee has built a career teaching people how to tell better stories in Hollywood by, borrowing from and expanding on Aristotle. And critical to this is a distinction that a lot of times it's a pair of distinctions, and I'm going to put the other one in here too, plot versus story. So the first distinction is characterization versus character. The second distinction is plot versus story. And Aristotle would say both of these things are about the difference between the details of something and its essence. Where is the core of the thing? Where is its character that defines how it unfolds? Robert McKee says, if the people you're writing in your story don't have any character, if all they are collections of his hair is brown, he's 6 foot tall, he likes to chomp a cigar. He says, this stuff, none of this is character. Not any of it. All of this stuff is characterization. This is what should an actor dress up as? How should he mimic the outward form of this person, right? But if the person doesn't, if the description of the person that the screenwriter is putting together doesn't go beyond the surfaces and the habitual tics, if it doesn't get down to what's at stake for this person, how do they make decisions? How do they value things? What do they notice and not notice in themselves and the world around them? If you don't expose those things, you can call it a character, but it just isn't one. So without those things, you don't have a story. And that's the second dichotomy. He says, plot is just one thing happening after another. Any number of us have seen action movies full of plots that did nothing for us. We just didn't care about the people or what was happening. And Robert McKee talks about why that happens in his book Story. And he says, the issue is if you don't have characters, if all you have is characterizations, nobody cares about them. You might as well have little cartoon paper cutouts and be moving them around. I mean, we have no emotional investment in them. We start to invest when we start to understand what makes them tick. Because that's when we start to get in, the part of us that's worried about our own lives starts to get involved when we understand enough about a character's life that we can start to see coming the problems that they're going to have. What is it that they're going to try to do to solve those problems, and why? Why are they going to try to solve the problems in that way? Now you're getting at issues of character. And the story, the arc of the story is not an arc of one thing happening after another. It's an arc of an emotional reaction to things going wrong. Is it funny? Is it sad? Is it romantic? That charge, he says, entirely comes out of your understanding of who the character is and what they thought was going to happen, which you may or may not agree with. You might be laughing your ass off because you knew this was not going to work, but you know why the character did it that way, because you're starting to see below the surface of the person to see the actual character at work. You can see them tick and you're like, oh no, don't offer him you offered him the apple. Oh God, here it comes, right? You're now operating at the level of story. You can see You're anticipating, not based on, I've seen a million action movies and this is what people put in action movies, but based on your understanding of this specific person and their character. You understand what's at stake for them. You know how they're going to feel about it. And you start to figure out whether it's going to work out for them or not, at least in the next beat of the story. So all of this, what's, you know, this is a way to, all of talking about Robert McKee, this is a way to illustrate what Aristotle would say is the critical difference between the details of a thing and the essence of the thing. It says, if all you have is details, you still don't really understand it or why it does the things it does. And as a result, you can't really empathize with it. I mean, maybe in a flat, shallow way, but you don't really have anything at stake. But it's when you start to get to the root of a thing and to know what it loves and what it doesn't love. Like if you know your tomatoes don't like cold weather and they don't like to be overwatered, and you know what happens if you do that, and you've had failed tomato crops where you thought that you were being the good gardener because you went out there and watered them every day, even when it was overcast, and they withered. You're like, why are the leaves turning yellow? I don't understand. But when you start to understand, no, they don't want to be that wet. Tomato plants can't deal with that. This is the story of the tomato. Is, you know, aside from what you see on the leaves and its you know, fruits and so forth, what's really at stake is, you know, it wants its feet not entirely dry, but not entirely wet either. And it really wants sunshine and warmth. And if it can't get those things, if the soil gets too cold, it almost doesn't matter what else you try to fix. You could dump fertilizer on there. You could buy the best tomato plants anybody ever made. They're not going to thrive. They're in the situation where that character, the character of the tomato, is being thwarted by its circumstances. And you can only understand that because you've gotten past some of the details to start to see the essence of what is it that makes a tomato plant tick. So with what you're talking about, you know, cosmopolitanism can operate either at the superficial form of characterization, plot, and details, or it can operate at the essential deep level of character and story and essence. If you encounter another culture, are you just impressed by how they dress up and how they do their hair? And so you say, I'm going to be this cosmopolitan dude, and you dress up like an Egyptian, and you get Egyptian hair, and you're like, get me, I'm Egyptian. And yet you're still living, you know, if you're an ancient Greek, you're still living an ancient Greek life while hallucinating that you're an Egyptian. You haven't got to the heart of what makes the Egyptians tick. You haven't got to the essence of their character as a culture. And as a result, you don't really know what you're looking at. You're as Heraclitus says, you're looking right at it and you still don't see it. So the thing that the ancient Greeks want out of their cosmopolitanism is, sure, lots of new details, that's fun, right? That's nice. But they're hoping that with enough new details, you'll get jarred out of complacency and you'll start to see some essential differences between those other people and how they live and value and make decisions versus how you live and value and make decisions. And that realization is your first dawning awareness that, hey, I'm a prisoner of a worldview. And I never knew it until this moment. I thought everybody lived like I do. Or if they didn't live like I do, I thought everybody lived in an inferior way and that my way was the best way. In any case, I thought I never had to take seriously my responsibility to learn how to grow out beyond myself and to not shed my old worldview, but to make it serve me so that I'm no longer its captive, to collect worldviews, to have a whole toolkit of worldviews so that I can shift around between them, because each worldview, including my favorite, my own blessed, beloved, we're number one worldview, is full of holes. We have a Swiss cheese view of reality ourselves. Everybody does. That's what it means to be immortal. We're missing more than we're getting. And if you really get to the core of a separate worldview through cosmopolitanism, you will start to see that some of what they see are things that you're missing. And the ability to temporarily at least put on their worldview is extremely helpful to critiquing what it is that you're missing in life. That's the level of cosmopolitanism that they're after here. And of course, the problem with it, tying back to these paragraphs that, you know, these opening two paragraphs of section H, is that neither Duloi nor Benalsoy are characterologically competent to evaluate things at the level of story or character or essence. When Shakespeare talks about a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, signifying nothing, we all go, oh, that's a fun phrase. That's nice. I'm gonna be able to quote that. And then we throw it out there from time to time. But what we don't understand is that he read his Aristotle. He knew what he was talking about. He's saying that genuine story can only be told by an Aristos, because a Banausos is too busy trying to stamp their ideology on every page. And a doulos is busy trying to stamp their own parochial experiences and feelings on every page. And in both cases, they're obsessed with characterization and plot and details. And they make an action movie and you don't care about it because nobody in it is a person. No one's got any character. And since there's no character, there's no story. There's nothing really at stake. And that's the only kind of story that an idiot can tell, because there's whole dimensions of life that are invisible to them. In the Swiss cheese worldview of a doulos or a Banausos, the part where the story and the character and the essence are in reality, that's all holes in the worldview of the doulos and Banausos. They don't see that stuff. It's invisible. It's not there. They don't feel any need to dig into that hole because they don't even see the hole. So with storytelling, with cosmopolitanism, with politics and governance, at every turn, what Kenneth Smith is saying about the ancient worldview is that the ancients believed that, or Kenneth would say, they recognized that when we look at the people around us in the world, it's just patently obvious, unless our worldview is full of holes that correspond to these spots. But if we can see into those spots, it's just patently obvious that people are not equal, that people are at different levels of maturity and development, not only in their own life, but also in the life cycle of Homo sapiens and what the Greeks would have considered to be the adult, mature, heuristic mind that's capable of caring about these things that the other stages of development don't even perceive and can't care about because they don't seem to be real to them. So I'm glad you brought up what you brought up, because I mean, it really goes to the heart. You know, when Aristotle is writing his work on politics and he's classifying different kinds of governments and the good forms of each one and the bad forms of each one, you know, that's all based on cosmopolitanism. And he's not just sticking with Athens. He's looking all over the Greek world. And frankly, he's looking beyond the Greek world. He's trying to collect every example he can of a government and make sure that his theory of government can address the essential features of all of these different examples and make sense out of them. He's trying to, well, Heraclitus would say that he's trying to look for the hidden harmony that underlies the surface details. What makes governance in Homo sapiens tick? When does it work? When does it not work? Why does it work when it works? Why does it not work when it doesn't work? Because he recognizes that if we can't figure that out, we have no chance at Sophrosyne. And without Sophrosyne, we'll destroy ourselves. The Greeks were obsessed with the Dark Age that they'd clawed their way out of. The Dark Age that their heroic ancestors created. They're like, our best and brightest wrecked everything. We have to understand how and why they did that, because if we don't, then we're going to wreck everything. This is what's on Aristotle's mind when he's classifying governments, because Sophrosyne is the key in which he and most of these people are writing, are thinking. So thanks for bringing it up, Phil. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was just going to talk about the recent history of the West. And of course, this question of the rise of the Banausos class, as we call them. And that was the issue in the Enlightenment. You know, we have Nietzsche and a few philosophers warning that we might be in for a rough ride in the 20th century. But they had the sterling example of the French Revolution already before them. And of course, for a century or so, the Banausos class of a place like France had been meeting in their salons discussing how they would run the state, because they had decided the aristocrats were degenerates, which is partly true and partly not true. You know, you look at Louis the 16th, and they write him off as a complete idiot. but he wasn't a complete idiot. He was seriously trying to keep the state together. So they spent decades in their salons dreaming about the time when they would have power. And when they got it, they screwed it up. They found out that their ideals didn't match the complexity of reality. And of course, you know, the irony is that one of the things the Enlightenment would say, oh, look at all the witch trials. We're better than that. And of course, the irony is that within 9 months, they'd slaughtered more people than the church had done in 300 years. And so we had that Benausseist revolution, and it still went on. The final aristocracies, after Metternich tried to revive the aristocracy in a sense and tried to keep it in power. By the early 20th century, we had come to more revolutions, more Benausseist taking over government, and the old aristocracy finally folding. And what did we get? We got, you know, the Soviets, we got the fascists, got the Nazis. These are all popular movements. These are all movements built on ideology. And they generally all claim that their inspiration was Hegel. Of course, Goethe and Schelling had warnings about Hegel. Goethe makes a line, you know, where Faust tries to retranslate the Bible and takes away and says, oh, in the beginning was a word. And he translates it, oh, first of all, in the beginning was the thought. Well, this is Hegel. Because what does the word mean? And in my limited little mind, I've come to the conclusion that the word, as it's expressed in the Bible, means the message. You're reading something which is succinct. You're looking at stuff and you're seeing the complexity. But no, Hegel says, no, I don't want reality. Just give me the thought. And of course, as Goethe points out, this goes downstream. Goethe, of course, famously, when we keep on saying the word, the Greeks thought this and that, I think it was Goethe who in particular popularized that mode of thinking. So in a romantic sense, he was going back to the ancient past and comparing it with the modern day. Now, Kenneth Smith is following in this line because we're talking about expanding beyond our modernist bubble and looking, here was an ancient culture. What were they doing? We realised they were doing stuff which is a bit outside our bubble. So that's the question. Another thing is, I think, Rick, if you can, give us a rundown on what you think the difference between existence and essence is. This is, of course, a point that Schelling brought up against Hegel, that he confused existence and essence. And apparently it looks like Schelling, in a sense, was the one that ticked off the existential movement as we know it. Not himself, but he sort of ticked off Kierkegaard. Schelling was sort of saying, well, the trouble with Hegel is he's just full of ideas and he's discounting reality. I'll give you an example. If we use the intellect, Schelling might point out, seems to have a bias. We go, why does something exist? Which is a good question. But the intellect seems to prefer nothing. The purity of nothingness is far preferable to actual existence as far as the intellect is concerned. But Schelling's saying, I'm sorry, but the positive is there is an existence in front of it, in front of us. the intellect can say that existence shouldn't be there, but it is there. And this seems to be a troubling aspect when we use intellect. There, Schelling said there's a negative element here, that we would far prefer nothingness to the existence of something in our minds. Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, the Nietzsche line, man would rather will the void than be void of will, comes to mind there about nothingness. But for those, who aren't as read in Goethe and Hegel and the rest that Stephen's talking about, I recommend this book, which you can read for free. It's at the Internet Archive by Karl Löwith, From Hegel to Nietzsche. And he basically talks about 19th century German philosophy from the beginning to the end. It's a series of relatively short chapters. It's pretty readable. And he's talking about where these guys got their ideas. He's quoting from their letters to each other, things that people don't normally read, but are very illuminating about what did they really think they were doing. And the opening chapters where he's talking about the pen pals, the letter correspondence between Goethe and Hegel is really interesting along the lines of what Stephen's talking about. This is some good stuff. So it's a lot of things to talk about in what Stephen said, and I'm not going to be able to do justice to all of it, but there's a couple points I want to make. And one is I want to reiterate this issue that there are things that from the modern perspective are inexplicable or very hard to explain that happened in the 20th century or the 19th century that the ancients would have no trouble at all explaining. And not because they have an ideology that causes them to do a cartoonish version of it, but because their blind spots are in a different place than our blind spots. So there's explanations for what happened. They're out there in the world, not in somebody's theory. They're just in the world itself. But the way that the modern worldview works, those parts of the world are invisible to us. We don't notice them. Our unconscious has been formatted by age 5 to the point we just don't notice those things. And so we can't care about them. And because we can't care about them, we can't theorize about them or try to, derive an explanation. We can't try to see how this part of reality might have set up this other part that we can see. So to us, the part we can see just seems to inexplicably pop out of nowhere. Why on earth did that happen? And we resort to caricature explanations, in lieu of the obvious one that's staring us in the face, but we can't see it because our worldview erases it from us. So this is going with what Stephen said, and I'm just going to underscore it. If the goal, let's just hypothesize, if the goal of the revolutionaries in the French Revolution was to kill the oligarchy because they felt the oligarchy had wrecked France and was making their lives miserable, this is what they said they were doing. They said, they might make exceptions here and there, but their job was basically to erase a class from existence. And they said, when those oppressors are gone, we will now be able to make the enlightened France we've always wanted to make. So far, so good. This is their statement. They say so. Then what the hell were they doing in southern France, massacring a religious minority that was never the oligarchy? Well, how did that happen? And all of the modern explanations are, violent people. They were irrational and they went crazy. Crazy people. Irrational people do crazy things. They got angry. Anger's bad. Anger's the bad emotion. Don't be angry. Forgive everybody immediately. You mustn't have anger. It will poison you and you'll behave like the French revolutionaries. I mean, we have this crazy explanations for why the French revolutionaries did that. And the real answer is that the reason that they were cutting off the heads of the oligarchy wasn't the reason they gave, right? It wasn't exclusively about trying to remove a class from their society who'd been their oppressors. It was about they had consciously decided that they'd reached a point in their history where instead of going along with history, they wanted to exert their wills to shape the future of their nation. They wanted to make conscious decisions about what would and wouldn't be included in the new France. And that's what they were loyal to. They were far more loyal to that, the will to power, Nietzsche would call it, than they were to any kind of abstract notion of we must excise the oligarchy from our. But they didn't know that that's why they were doing it. They thought that it was about they believed their own bullshit. They thought it was about the oligarchy. And thus they themselves were unable to explain how the revolution went awry and they began killing people who were not oligarchs. And the people who followed weren't able to explain it. But the idea that this is actually what was at stake for them, you can see in the fact that after they finished chopping off lots and lots of heads, they then set about using their will to redefine everything else. I mean, they created the metric system, right, which we still use today. They decided to redefine the week as base 5 or base 10, and they renamed all the days of the week. I mean, everything.
Everybody drive on the wrong side of the road.
They wanted to rationalize everything. It was what the ancients referred to as logos culture. It was the belief that tradition is the enemy, unexamined. You know, when Socrates says the unexamined life is not worth living for a man, every banalsos in the world goes, right on, man. Everything should be a conscious choice. Nothing should be allowed to happen unless I decided that it can happen. My will is in charge. And my will says things should be done systematically. So we're going to design systems, and the systems will make decisions for us. And whatever those decisions are, no matter how unhealthy or inhumane, well, we have to do it because that's what the system says, and the system's going to think for us. This is the banalsic noetic mindset in action. And yet it lacks the insight to fully understand what it's doing. So it will then carry out pogroms like it did in southern France, wiping out religious minorities, the whole time being in denial, A, that it's doing it, and B, why it's doing it. And centuries of people afterwards trying to explain the French Revolution will have the same problem trying to explain it, because the flaw that led them to do the things they did in France is the flaw that is at the core of all the modern worldview. We believe in rational governance. We think reason and intellectual systems of decision making are the right way to do everything. And there should be no other way of making decisions, not the big ones. Maybe people's hobbies they can be emotional about, but you know, we think governance and whose head gets chopped off, that should all be the result of calculation. And the fact that all of this eventually leads to a dystopia in which computers decide who to exterminate and who can live, this, we don't want to think about the consequences of systems that are unaccountable to reality and unaccountable to feeling and emotion and parochial experience. We don't want to examine ourselves that closely. This is why I'm running with what Stephen said. Is what Stephen said goes hand in hand with what Kenneth Smith is saying in these opening 2 paragraphs of section H. He's saying it takes a different quality of mind to be competent to critique its own thinking and its own premises realistically as an adult than what predominates in Homo sapiens.
And this is a painful process?
It's a painful process. And most of us don't want to do things that are uncomfortable. And so that rules out most of us right off the bat from ever critiquing our own belief systems enough to be able to behave like an adult. So I'm right there with Stephen on this, you know, consequences of actions. And if anybody wants, in case anybody thinks this is a fluke, the one that we've been using for the last several months that we bring up over and over and over is, when Lenin set out to do the Russian Revolution, there was one outcome above all other outcomes he absolutely didn't want. He didn't want Russia to be a capitalist country. He wrote all kinds of books in which he laid out his critiques of capitalism, what was wrong with it, why they absolutely shouldn't be capitalist, and what he was going to do instead. And the course of action that Lenin set in motion has led today to Russia being a capitalist country. Lenin did that. Now, you can find diehards who will say, no, Lenin did the right thing, and it was later people who corrupted his vision. But the truth is, he set in motion a series of events that had an outcome that wasn't what he intended. The law of unintended consequences plagues mortals. It's part of what it means to be mortal. We don't know all the things we're setting in motion when we act in the world. But when we think systematically, intellectually, lawfully, logically, when we fall for the noetic fallacy, the belief that we should let noesis be our master and not a servant, part of what comes with that in that act of subservience and dedication to the intellectual life is a rejection of the law of unintended consequences. We say our system is good enough, by which we mean effectively perfect. It's good enough.
Perhaps a rejection of the idea of chaos.
Yes. Right. The idea of chaos is another way to express the law of unintended consequences. And the idea is
The modern doesn't believe in chaos.
we think we can order everything. If we just follow our systems and keep tinkering with and improving our systems, that will achieve perfection. And this entire thing is a delusion. It's an ideology that is a natural consequence of what happens when you make one of the two faculties of your mind your master, and you do whatever it says, no matter what it says. I'm sorry, I can't. What does the non-Nazi Germans say in 1935? I mean, I know it's terrible that we're doing all these things to those people, but I can't disobey the law. That would be wrong. The law says I have to report my neighbors when they're Jews, so I'm going to report them because I'm a good law-abiding person. I submit my mind and life to my system, because to do otherwise is chaos. We can't have chaos. That's the source of all evil things. So we will be lawful.
Well,
And
the state has replaced God.
Yeah, the state, or more specifically, to put it in a less left versus right way, the system has replaced God. That's what happens when you're a Benausos. You have too much faith in systematic thinking. So the things you're talking about, whether it's Russia, whether it's the French Revolution, we could pull countless examples out of history in which we see that people, being as systematic as they can, produce consequences that weren't at all anywhere on their agenda, and then struggle afterwards to explain it, because the thing that they were acting on was some essential part of the character of their revolution that they themselves didn't understand. You can't trust them to tell you what they're actually up to. You can only trust them to tell you what they think they're up to.
Well,
So-
it seems they treat reality as a soft dough that will come out exactly the way that their cookie cutter says it will.
That's right. That's right. Because their mind, what happens when you shift from the dualic worldview and experience of life into the Benausic worldview and experience of life is a rejection based on all the weaknesses of being too emotional, too parochial, blah, blah, blah. You're like, I don't want to be that person I was when I was a baby. I don't want to be babyish. I don't want to be a little kid crying because I got something wrong. I don't want to be that kid who wet his pants. All those embarrassing things that happen when you can't separate yourself from the flow of experience, that all acts on someone who becomes and I know what I'm talking about because I became an intellectual. That all acts on the person to motivate the intellectual to say, I am never going to be that person ever again. I'm going to be scrupulous about trying to live a disciplined, intellectual, intelligent life. But the problem is that when you do that, and Hegel's crystal clear on this issue, when you do that, you forget that when you're throwing out the bathwater, you're chucking the baby. The reason that we have those powerful emotions and those powerful attachment to what we see and smell and taste and touch is that that's our conduit to reality. If it weren't for the senses, we would have no contact with reality at all. And if it weren't for our emotions, reality wouldn't be able to get our brain's attention. It uses the emotions to compel us to care about the things that we're experiencing, to focus on the things that matter. And it's not a perfect system. There's plenty of things about the way that Gnosis works that are imperfect. But if we detach ourselves from it and become planners and thinkers and systematizers, as Hegel says, what we've detached ourselves from is not just the embarrassing parts of being too emotional and hard on your sleeve and being a raw wire. We've also detached ourselves from our direct connection to reality. So now our brain is inhabiting the imaginary world of theory, in which all of our theories work out, because that's the world that theory projects, right? When you do math, math doesn't project a picture of the world in which math fails miserably all over the place. It projects a world in which math usually works. Math answers are usually the right answers according to math. And that's the truth for any other system of thinking. It creates an ersatz substitute world. And somebody who's thinking in that world can't be trusted to govern, because they're too detached from the consequences of their actions. This is what the Greeks believe. Greeks believe there's people like that. There's nothing we can do about it. There's a lot of them. There are things that they can do in society that are very helpful, and that's great. But one thing you must not ever do is let them decide who lives and who dies. Or the next thing you know, they're stamping numbers on people's arms. I mean, this is the logical consequence of living in a systematized fantasy world and thinking in those terms. Anyway, thank you, Stephen. I'm going to go to the rest of the people who are waiting. So let's start with James. Come off mute, James. Tell us what's on your mind.
I think this kind of the ability to be able to critique oneself, one's own reason. You know, it reminds me of Kant's critique of reason, right? I mean, he's trying to bring us back to what is real. We have to depend on our senses, our experience, and what appears to us in the phenomenal world. And that kind of critique is supposed to, save us from this kind of getting lost in that, the Gnostic world of theory and systems and so forth, right? And it's basically, it's really a story of the entire conflict in civilized life, isn't it? It's Freud's Civilization is Discontent really captures that kind of conflict between the panopticon and the dualic, our desires, our experiences, our raw experiences, and
Right.
and culture, right? And so we can't help but be part of culture. At the same time, we also need to understand that we are, individuals that need to acknowledge our real experiences, and that's also important. But it's I guess this reference to Kant and Aristotle and so forth is a way to find some kind of middle ground, moderation between the two competing forces in ourselves, right, in our lives. And
so that's a critical issue you raise right there. What is the proper relationship between these two half-witted faculties that we're born with and how we should live our lives? And a modern answer would be, well, why don't we compromise between them? Or if we can't compromise, why don't we balance one or the other, right? It's why when moderns read Aristotle talking about the golden mean, we always think he means in the middle. You should be a centrist. You should be a moderate. If you're just moderate and stick in the middle of the herd, then the carnivores can't eat you, right? They'll eat somebody else. There's all this programming, right? Underlying unconscious programming underlying what seems to us a rational decision. But Aristotle couldn't have been clearer when he said the golden mean does not mean the middle. He's defining the virtues, and he's saying each virtue is defined as occupying a position somewhere between too much of some quality and too little of some quality. So you say, what is the quality in question? And then you got to name, what does it mean when you don't have enough of it? And then you got to name, what does it mean when you have too much? And he says the golden mean is somewhere between those. But then he says, but not in the middle. I mean, maybe once in a blue moon it'll be in the middle, but usually it's going to be towards off center from the middle. And sometimes it'll be so off center as to be very close to one of the extremes. Sometimes the quality in question, it would be great if you had a whole lot of it, not some insipid amount of it, some kind of compromise between too much and too little. And in other qualities, it might be really good if you had almost none of that. Maybe once in a blue moon, you should pull it out and use it in your life. But the rest of the time, you should keep your hands off it. And he says, when people try to solve this through balance or compromise by finding a spot in the middle, what happens is that they almost always miss the mark. Hamartia, right? The word for missing the mark. And as a result, they're almost always not virtuous while imagining that they're being virtuous through a compromise. So part of what's interesting about the dialectic, this thing that the Greeks are so obsessed with, and Hegel talks about, is that in the case of the dialectic, if you've got two opposing qualities, like let's say gnosis, which is making your life an emotional live wire of experience, and noesis, which is separating you from your emotions and your connections to reality to allow you to plan and think systematically. So you've got these two faculties. What Hegel says is that the sweet spot is not in the middle. It's not a compromise. Because if you water down your gnosis, it means you're watering down your connection to reality. And that is the last thing in the world you should be watering down. But by the same token, we're not saying that you should be a doulos who's just 100% gnosic and never noetic, because noesis, you also need that. There's a reason it evolved in us. The ability to plan is one of our superpowers. I mean, as a species, that we can see the pattern. We can abstract ourselves from the circumstances of our life and detect a pattern and then make plans about that pattern and then change the world and change our lives as a result of that abstract thinking. He says, we can't do without that. The goal isn't to go back to being monkeys or rats. The goal is to use both faculties at 100%. You can't do that with a balancing act, and you can't do that with a compromise. So Hegel talks about the dialectic, and he says the dialectic is that you string the two opposites together into a dynamic system where when you go too far in one direction, the other one pulls you. It's not saying you can't go further. You can if that's what you need to do, but it becomes a powerful system in which both of them can be turned all the way up. It's what Heraclitus talks about when he says people don't understand how that which is at variance with itself can agree with itself. He says there's a power in the bending back, which the palantropos is the word he uses. He says, as in the case of the bow and the lyre. So the bow, the wood isn't being compromised and the string isn't being compromised, but they're put into tension with each other. And the result is a powerful dynamic system that can respond no matter which way it's pushed with enormous energy. So you're getting 100% of the good of the wood and 100% of the good of the string to create this kind of new generator. And it's the same with the lyre. So that's that's the only, everything you were saying, James, I'm right with you. The only caution is that word compromise or balance that gets us the wrong direction. What we want is to turn this passive accumulation of, now I have some gnosis and now I have some noesis and I pour them together into a soup and, now I have mental soup. He's like, no. You want to create a dynamic system between the two. That's wonderful.
So what was the critique that Stephen was talking about made by Schelling and Goethe against Hegel, that he was maybe claiming to be maybe an aristoi by settling on some kind of absolute system of thought?
Yeah, Hegel's got some problems, and some of the problems have to do with the fact that he's breaking new ground, and as a groundbreaker, his life is full of interesting things going on as he breaks that ground, and it means that the conscious mind can only keep track of 7 plus or minus 2 things at a time, and that means he's missing all kinds of things that are happening as a result of his breaking the ground. And especially what he's missing the most is issues in himself and in his own ideology and his own worldview. He's missing them because he's so conscious of the impact it has when he takes Kant's philosophy and subjects it to the dialectic and all these other things. And so it's later philosophers who go back and look at Hegel and say, for somebody who said you care about the dialectic, you've got a number of very flattened mechanical things in your philosophy that you never questioned. So a couple of examples. One of the examples that he's missing is that Hegel did all this because he was a devout Lutheran. And he wanted to prove that Lutheranism is the end product of history. It's the highest form of evolution. And people will never experience true freedom until they become Lutherans. He says it. It's really embarrassing to read. He talks about how most people don't have any freedom at all. They're prisoners of their psyche, and how the Greeks discovered the concept of freedom, but they could never. I translated this. It's really embarrassing to read. He says, but they could never fully experience the truth of liberty because they weren't Christians, and only Christianity fully liberates us, and everybody else is still a partial slave. So God bless Lutheran. He doesn't say the words God bless Lutheranism, but that's his punchline. His punchline is genocidal. And it's genocidal because we inherited a reflex for genocide from 1,000 years of medieval history. Right? The idea that there's one correct view, all the other views are wrong, and that what we need to do is either convert the other people or exterminate them. And then in the end, we'll have a perfect, pure world run according to the way God wants it. This was the medieval program. It was genocide. And Hegel is only partway through the modern epoch. He doesn't fully understand which parts of the old order were good and which ones were bad. And he doesn't fully understand which parts of the old epoch were left behind and which ones have been unwittingly carried forward that are still ruling us. So like all of us on this call, he still had that purifying genocidal unconscious impulse programmed into him. So he wasn't capable of questioning whether it was true that Lutheranism represents the, the end point of history and the highest possible evolution of freedom and Homo sapiens. And as a result, he bent his system to support his conclusion that he wanted to reach. And you can watch him do it line by line in his lectures and in his books. Once you know that he's got that problem, you can see him doing it. And he does the same thing about Europe. Europe, white people are the best people. He doesn't come out and say the words, but he basically lays out the entire framework about it's not a coincidence that, Germany just happens to be the best place, the best and the brightest. And it came as a result of, the forces of history led to this moment where Hegel is the best thing there could be. Isn't that fabulous? And he doesn't even know he's saying it. If it were pointed out to him what an egotist he was being, he'd be humiliated. He didn't want to be an egotist, but he couldn't see it because that was the way everybody talked about Germany. All the Germans talked that way. Nietzsche, on the other hand, when he starts writing about Germans, he just has withering criticism for how much 19th century Germans were so proud of themselves. They were just sure that everybody else was inferior. And he predicted bad things are coming when you combine that with extreme militarism and the belief that it's your goal to purify the world and put yourself on top. Nietzsche says this is not going to end well. And of course, as we said, I think about 6 months ago, Brahms saw it too. That's why Brahms wrote his Fourth Symphony the way that he did. His Fourth Symphony is a critique of the rise of German nationalism. And he's saying, the old Austria is dying. The old beautiful ways focused on art and civilization are being replaced with a militarist, expansionist, genocidal program. And I hate it. And so the Fourth Symphony is this homage to the beauty that was once there in Austria and to the rise of the pain and the difficulties to come. That final fourth movement of Brahms' symphony is so angry. I mean, Beethoven's Fifth has nothing on this. It's just, it's the Passacaglia with all the variations, and it turns into this very, very angry thing. And he breaks the rules of the symphony so that all the music people know what he's saying. He starts out in a minor key, and when he gets to the end, to the strongest, most powerful moment in the symphony at the very end, he doesn't turn it to the positive. He doesn't bring it back to the major. Beethoven did in the Fifth, but Brahms says, no, we should not be feeling triumphant. There's something bad coming, and we're doing it. It's our fault. We should be questioning ourselves. I'm going to end in the minor, angry in the minor key. So people could see it. People could see this thing, but Hegel couldn't see it. He was too early in the 19th century. He was at a point in history where he was blind to his own contributions that were distorting, that caused him to distort his own philosophy. You think if there was anything that Hegel wouldn't mess up, it would be his own philosophy, because he was so committed to the breakthrough, the revolutionary breakthrough of seeing ideas developing organically, like the bud, the blossom, and the fruit, rather than the artificial cage match of Kant's thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Hegel's like, no, that's a waste of time. If we want to understand the world, what we see in the world is growth and development and the unfolding of new order from inside the old order. And he's quoting the Greeks there. He's talking about the seeds of our future self are already within us, and we're gradually changing and becoming the new thing. And he says the same is true of ideas, the same is true of cultures, the same is true of epochs. He's applying this gestational embryogenetic model. And he does it to his own philosophy right up until it would cause him to question his Lutheranism or his German supremacy. And then he backs off and he bends it to make it fit the conclusion. And he doesn't notice that he's doing it. So as a result of that, I think one of the things that Stevens pointed out before, and I'll just wrap up with this, but I mean, one of the things is that Hegel not only acts as a touchstone for socialists, right, who were really excited about the dialectic, which they got through Marx, and Marx got it through Hegel. Fascists are also excited about Hegel. Hegel, the way that he bent things around to support, basically German supremacy, it really lends itself to, Nazi ideology. And it's not a coincidence that it goes both ways, because he had what should have pointed us in the direction of health as the core of his revolutionary philosophical insights, but then he bent them to fit the ethnocentrism and jingoism of his time without noticing he did it. I think I've mentioned it before, but for those new to the call, the most extreme example of this is a much simpler one. Hegel denied the possibility that there could be Chinese philosophy. Said, of course there can't be Chinese philosophy. Have you seen their writing system? It's too primitive. You can't say anything. And it turns out the writing system that he thought that the Chinese used was the I Ching. Somebody gave him a book on the I Ching and he thought that was the sum total of he literally thought that was the sum total of the Chinese writing system. And he's like, you can barely express anything with something this primitive. So obviously they don't have philosophy. Why would he think that a culture on Earth would have the I Ching as its writing system and not have the ability to express their complete language? I mean, it's crazy. Anybody would look at that and go, huh, I must be mistaken about the Chinese. I should learn some more. It's not like there weren't books around on the Chinese.
Schopenhauer tried to warn us.
Right? Schopenhauer tried to warn us. Yes.
Hegel.
Yes. But to finish the thing about Hegel, there was plenty of information around had Hegel desired to see China as a competitive civilization. There's plenty of information around he could have looked at and go, oh, my mistake. That's just a fortune-telling device. That's not their writing system. This is their writing system. Oh my God, it's the most complex writing system on Earth. Maybe they can have philosophy. I mean, the information was there for him to notice. Why wouldn't he notice it? He was an educated guy working in an educated place as a professor, and his focus of his philosophy was about knowledge and how we know things and think things. Why wouldn't he exert himself to pick up a book and look and say,
this is a point Schopenhauer made. Of course, it was out of spite, but he was warning. Hegel was short on facts.
Hegel was short on facts, right? He's thinking hypernoidically. He's thinking in terms of his system. And his system doesn't just include the good parts of his philosophy, it also includes his ideologies about how great it is to be Lutheran and how great it is to be German and how inferior everybody else is. And that's all in there. And so as a result, the easiest thing in the world for him to do, which you would think would be the most character thing for him to do, which is to reach out his hand and pick up a book and discover that the Chinese have a language, he doesn't take that step. Why would he? His ideology's already given him the answer. As Stephen says, why does he need facts when he's got the ideological answer, the systematized intellectual answer, tells him all he needs to know. So, he's got his weak spots. He remains a touch spot for philosophy because the dialectic is this huge breakthrough for us. And the language he gave us to talk about these functions of the mind and how they work and the kinds of thoughts that people can have, this is great stuff. If only he'd applied that to critique himself. And this is why Nietzsche goes after him. And it's why Kenneth Smith is constantly quoting that Kafka line that says, he was permitted to attain the Archimedean standpoint, i.e. the place where with a long enough lever you can move the world, but only on the condition that he use it against himself. And Kafka doesn't mean, haha, things suck, which was how I read it for 20 years. What Kafka means is, you're not a philosopher unless you're using your philosophy to critique your own favorite ideas. If you're not picking apart your own ideologies and blind spots, all you are you're a pugilist who uses words. You're just out there punching other people with your philosophy. It's not genuine philosophy, it's sophistry. To be philosophy, you have to critique yourself all the way back down to the foundations of your thinking and valuing to see why you reach the conclusions you do. Why do you have the blind spots that you have? And those are the things that are going to teach you where you need to grow. Right? I mean, as a philosopher, you want to grow to remove the blind spots. But as long as you don't look for any blind spots in what you see, you can't grow there. And this is what Kenneth Smith's whole book is about, which is why I'm so excited about Stephen and James and the things that they just raised here is that this brings us full circle back to why Kenneth Smith wrote this book. Moderns who have never learned to look at the world through an alien worldview, a contra-modern worldview, are ideologues and prisoners. Doesn't matter how smart they are, how educated they are, how virtuous they are, how well-meaning they are, what a nice guy they are, what nice paintings they make, how they take care of their dog. None of that stuff changes the fact that when all you have is a single worldview that you've had your entire life, you're a prisoner. You're an ideologue. You're a puppet. You are a symptom of your worldview rather than being a genuine individual, according to the ancient Greeks. And so for us, true freedom only comes after the first time we discover a truly alien worldview, learn to use it, and then learn to use it to critique our original worldview, that's when we learn our worldview should never be our master, because it's Swiss cheese, it's full of holes. It's not just the mistakes, as bad as those are. It's the things that we can't even think when we're in that worldview, because whole parts of reality are invisible to us. They're in front of us, but somehow they're never the topic of conversation. Our conscious mind just somehow never finds it interesting to focus on that area. We think that's the boring stuff, and hiding in the boring stuff will turn out to be the most important parts of life, but just things that our worldview doesn't want us thinking about. Because if you think those things, you start to question your worldview, and then an epoch survives to the extent to which it can keep you from questioning it, right? The point at which you start to question it starts to fall apart. So anyway, this is why I'm so excited about what James and Stephen said. This really comes back to why Kenneth wrote this book. So the book is an exercise in learning to see the world through three worldviews: through the ancient worldview, which is what we're finishing up, the next month or two, section H of chapter 4. Then the medieval worldview, which will take a year or two, which we haven't started yet, but we're going to get there this year. I can tell by the date. And then finally, to look at the modern worldview with fresh eyes, to say, we have never understood our own worldview because we are the fishy swimming in that water. We took it for granted. We didn't know it had blind spots, not any real important ones. But after we've learned to see through the ancient worldview and the medieval worldview, we will be able to turn those on to the modern worldview, and blind spots in the modern worldview will just show up like crazy. There will be all kinds of things that are easy to say from a medieval perspective or from an ancient perspective that you almost can't say at all in the modern perspective. And when we know those things, we will finally know our gnothi seat, and we will finally know our own worldview and be in a position to make choices as an adult and not as a prisoner of the ideology we were born into. So James, Stephen, thank you very much for bringing those up. Phil, come off mute and tell me what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'll first say something in passing about the I Ching, and then I'll get to my point. I mean, even if he saw that Chinese writing was just simply the I Ching, those dashes, he could have seen that it's very much like a computer language, zeros and ones. And of course, he didn't have computers, but he did have the Babylonian writing, the writing on clay tablets between dots and dashes. Is a very, very complex system, and it's very, very productive. So even on the basic language, even if he misunderstood it, he could see that there might be potentials in that, because that's what the Rosetta Stone reveal in a way. So that was wrong. But my main point is that the problem is that we are left on a very fundamental level on a phenomenology of experience. That's our relationship to the reality, and which we create a representation of what would be. And I wonder whether that could ever get to actually definitively see what reality is, which is much more problematic. It seems to me, well, all we have left is that, and then even with the Merleau-Ponty's, the intersubjectivity of human understanding, that is still what looking at images at a screen, so to speak, and thinking that represents what reality is. We know, for example, color is in one sense only a psychological phenomenon, it's not real, because we have electromagnetic waves. They are nothing like colors. Color is a secondary effect that we experience, and it's very real to us, and it's very, very important in terms of that. My thought is, I have slowly come to realize the experiment I made when I was about 40 years ago about the blind spot. That triggered my memory about, when you talk about the Swiss cheese, the human relationship is full of holes. I remember the blind spot. We have this tendency to project the whole image to the thing. I'll describe it very briefly and get to the essential point. when you look at the blind spot, in a sense, let's say you have a blind spot, if it's filled up with the grounding that makes it a totality, because you don't want a hole there. And so I put that against, like a red dot in the white paper and hold it blind spot, the paper is completely white. Because obviously you don't see the Swiss cheese, but your mind wants to project the fact that it's whole. And it's very likely that spot was filled with white because of everything else white. I tried newsprint on that, like a cut out newspaper. I put a hole in there, and of course, it's filled with newsprint. And so, so your mind has a way of filling in the Swiss cheese, It's kind of like taking Swiss cheese home, just filling the hole. That it's like, oh, this is really Swiss cheese without the hole. So I finally, after several experiments, I decided, I'm going to actually make a ramp, this taper with the bigger spot and smaller and smaller and smaller. And there was 4 dots on the paper, and in the middle was the blind spot. And I covered that blind spot. And you asked me how many spots are there? It's 5. No problem. Okay. That's the actuality versus the reality. I knew that there was only 4. I knew there was only 4, but my eyes tells me, my experience, my phenomenology tells me there's 5. And if I wasn't being very careful, I would say 5. I swear in the stack of Bible, it was 5, I won't bet my life on it, but I'll bet your life on it. So in some sense, and then I decided, I'm going to have to really crunch it down and see how many dots there are. There could only be 4 or 5. I know that. Okay. 4 is a real number with the Swiss cheese covering up. And 5 is the experiential number. I tried counting it, and counting 4 or 5 spots is not, it's a symphony. I'm actually saying something wonderful. So in some sense, it's either 4 or 5. It's not. I get lost. Like there's 100 spots, and I just I forgot, and I kept trying, and I couldn't do it. I really could not tell reality from actuality. I literally got nauseous. I tried to actually understand 4 or 5. It got to be one of those numbers. And I couldn't do it. I kept getting lost by the time I get to, 3 or 4 or whatever. I do it again. I finally got sick, and I just decided I can't reach reality. That's why I can never be an astro. I could never be the supreme leader because I can't tell the difference, because based on the balance of what my experience is, And I don't know if anybody can. I mean, maybe there's somebody who actually can say, oh, there's definitely only 4 spots with a hole in the middle. So finding the balance between your phenomenological experience becomes a problem in terms of how to relate actuality from reality. That's why we begin that actuality is actually more real than reality, because we don't know what reality is in a funny way. So is that good enough? Does that depend on the tension between the two, the thinking and the feeling? And in some sense, that gets into the problem of the elasticity of the tension, right? At some point, the tension gets too, and you break the string, you break the bow,
Right.
If it's too loose, it doesn't work. So in some sense, finding that balance is something that we have to do ourselves. And I think having a community in some sense helps, because, like, I suppose, 40 million Frenchmen can't be wrong. So maybe that's all, maybe all we have is the averages of opinion to a certain degree. And they've done experiments, with jelly beans and, in a big bowl. And in some sense, even smart people can't figure out how many is. When you average out a lot of poor opinions and a lot of good opinions, it comes out more accurate, which is sort of amazing. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Phil.
Now you can begin the symphony.
Yeah, I mean, to someone who, one of the interesting things is that although the two half-witted modes of life, the experience and emotions only mode, hypergnosis, the dualic mode on the one hand, and the hypernoetic, intellectual systematizing mode of life, although they both, are forms of idiocy. By the definition that we've used before, idiot means one's own, where we're obsessed with our own things. It's either our own experiences and feelings on the one hand, or it's our own ideologies and logics and systems on the other. Nevertheless, there are times where they're not equal to each other. They're not equivalent. They make different kinds of errors. Someone who's just driven relentlessly by appetites, it's not that they can't commit genocide. It's just that it's way down low on the list. It's like it's a little abstract. They're more likely to kill someone they know, personally with a knife in a fit of passion. But the same goes for their strengths. They have different strengths. So there are different things that you can get one or the other to almost appreciate about what they're missing. They're like, this is a complex living system, the way that they see the world. So one of the things that I like is part of what you're saying is there's a lot more going on than we think there is in the world. And the question is, how much of that stuff matters for the decision at hand? Whatever it is I'm about to do or consider doing, how much of that do I need to take into account? And unfortunately, there too, we're using the same flawed faculty to decide whether the flawed faculty is good enough and whether we're close enough. So, I really, in my life, I spend a lot of time collecting optical illusions and examples from science of things that are right in front of us all the time that we can't see. So I just shared a link to an article that shows some photos of birds under different kinds of light. And of course, the really dramatic one is that the starling looks like a boring black bird, very little going on, maybe some gray dots maybe on its breast, and that's about it. But under ultraviolet light, the thing is a rainbow. It's so colorful. And starlings, of course, can see ultraviolet light. They don't see the boring bird that we see. They see this really flamboyant, totally expressive animal. And the same is true, the peacock mantis shrimp, which it looks colorful to us, but by comparison with what it actually is, it looks completely bland, because it actually has colors all throughout the ultraviolet and infrared spectrums. It has polarized light coming off of it, light polarized two different ways coming off of it. I mean, it's hard for a human being to even express what we're missing. And it's when you get into things like squid in shoals, which coordinate their behavior by flashing light at each other. And they generate the light in their own body, luminescence in the skin. And that light too is happening in a much wider range of light than we can perceive. So basically, we're missing most of the message most of the time. We're just getting a narrow slice. And then we're telling ourselves that it's good enough because, and if you're a doulos, you have doulic explanations for why it's good enough. Having to do with, didn't hurt me none. It's I'm able to get what I want, things done in the world without any problem. But if you're a Benausos, you have Benausic explanations, like man is the measure of all things, which is some weird Benausic bullshit. Or we have set a standard for what's important, and our standard says those things aren't important. Of course, failing to recognize that nature is not bound.
Well, let me ask you a question. Let's say when Oppenheimer was about to explode the bomb, instead of like an incalculable number of possibilities of, let's say, flashing the atmosphere and the chain reaction, it was just either 4 or 5, which is what I faced. Like, is it going to be 4 which is like, is safe or is it going to be 5? You know, and he can't even tell it's 4 or 5. Like whether to explode the bomb and set off a chain reaction in the atmosphere. We're playing with a very dangerous thing. It's not a matter to counting the dots, but something very simple, not like, you know, like 1 in 10,000, you know, which is what the real odds were, but it's like 4 or 5, make a decision.
Uh-huh.
How can you make a decision when, you know, he should be getting sick and throwing up? You know, like, I can't tell whether it's going to be 4 or 5. I mean, that's incredible. I mean, if that's true, I mean, maybe I'm very, very deficient. Maybe if I was smarter, I could say, oh, it's definitely 4. No problem. Go explode the bomb.
Yeah. And, you know, in addition to these kind of optical illusions, to help us understand the existence of cognitive illusions, right? That's the real important thing here. Because an optical illusion, at least you can see evidence that something's wrong with your vision. But a cognitive illusion, like an ideology, which has a Swiss cheese full of holes version of reality, we can't see visually that there's a problem because it's all inside our head. There's no picture anywhere. So for these, it's useful to spend some time with optical illusions. But then what's really helpful, I think, is looking at Hannah Arendt's essay, Truth in Politics. Truth in Politics by Hannah Arendt is just a brilliant essay. And it's in Between Past and Future, but not the earliest edition, only the later edition. Late 1960s edition. She wrote it in like 67 or something, and they added 2 chapters to her pre-existing book. So if you go to the Internet Archive, they're only going to offer you the old version that doesn't have the last 2 chapters, so it doesn't have Truth in Politics. But in there, she points out the simplest kind of cognitive illusion, and I think part of what we need in the world is we need somebody to catalog our cognitive illusions for us so we can talk about them. So we can all agree, okay, yeah, those are real things. We really do struggle with these things. When we have a bunch of optical illusions cataloged, and we have logical fallacies cataloged, and Freudian defense mechanisms are cataloged, we should be cataloging our cognitive illusions. And she points out one. And the one that she points out is, she says, there are 3 radically different kinds of truth. Those different kinds of truth are answerable to different ways of establishing if they're valid or not. If we confuse which kind of truth we're dealing with and try to apply the laws of validity of a different kind of truth, we will get false outcomes every time. And a simple example is political truth. What does the majority think? Well, when it comes to my brain surgery, the last thing in the world I want is the majority getting a vote cut by cut on what happens in my brain. I want the best brain surgeon in the world to be the one making those choices. And I want everybody else to shut the fuck up and don't jar the man's hand, right? He's trying to save my life. But there are people who don't understand that there's any kind of truth that isn't a political truth. This is like people who spend all their life in cliques, you know, on forums arguing about things, and they think the majority rules even reality. Now, if you asked them that in those terms, they might say, well, of course it doesn't rule the law of gravity or anything. But if you don't ask them and you just watch how they live their life, you realize that they're living they're living their life as though they did think that the vote of the electorate is binding upon the cosmos. And that's a problem, because it's not. And Hannah Arendt quotes some very simple examples, you know, like you go into your backyard and you see a deer. Just for a moment, it comes out of the brushes and there's a deer. There's nobody else around. You're the only person who sees it. And then the deer goes back in the bushes and doesn't come back. Did that happen? Well, a vote of the electorate is not going to help you determine that. It doesn't matter what the majority says. They weren't there. And she says the hard thing for most people to understand is that most things that happen since the dawn of time are of this category. They're not up for vote. They happened because they happened and for no other reason. You can't logically prove them. You can't vote on them. None of that matters. It's a category mistake to think that other opinions matter about whether that occurred or not. And it's a category mistake to try try to apply the laws of a lawyer's proof in a courtroom to whether or not the deer came out of the woods. It doesn't matter what the law says. The deer was there, even if the law says it wasn't. You know, and it's the same with logic. You can logically prove the deer didn't come out of the woods, and it still did. It's like this. She says this category of truth is very hard for people to accept. And I think the three that she says is there's political truth, there is actual truth of things that happen in the actual world, and her other category, I think, is it's what we would call systematic formulaic truths. I mean, she refers to it as like laws of nature, like the Pythagorean theorem. She says those are true because, you know, that's the way math works. It will always be true. It'll be true if nobody proves it. It'll be true if nobody witnesses it. It's true by definition because it's the world of definitions. So we might call that noetic truth or Banausic truth, although political truth is also a form. So if we can be so confused, even about something as simple as which of the three kinds of truth is this, and what are the rules that apply to that kind of truth, surely we can be more confused cognitively about more complicated things. And most things in life are going to be more complicated than just what is it, you know? So the scope of error in the human mind is essentially infinite. We can make amazing collections of errors. Donald, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
More and more the way y'all keep talking. My gosh. First, I'm just fascinated by Stephen's idea of incomplete idiocy, because that seems to me to be almost a virtue that's better than being a complete idiot, that we're a failure to make it. It's a good thing. Yeah, I wanted to defend, I think you're talking about earlier, the French Revolution. Why'd they go off down to South France and slaughter the Huguenots? But, to defend France, they lost the Algerian War because they couldn't bring themselves to torture the women. There was a line beyond which they wouldn't go, which surprises me every when I read about that war or something, that they were unwilling to be that brutal enough to win it. And some things about Hegel. I was really surprised by what you said about Hegel and Luther, because Luther, I haven't read all of Luther, but I did read at one time intently his writings on free will, which is, there's only one thing worth willing, and that is one's own salvation. And you can't do that. That is a gift from God, and therefore you have no free will in any meaningful sense. You can will about things that don't matter, but you can't will about the only thing that's an essential question for your life. And that's weird that Hegel wouldn't have thought about that and said, I don't know.
No, it is weird.
And then I was really liked kind of thinking about your Banausic thought process, that they have a world in which actually they have a logical world in which there is no reductio ad absurdum, that you can't follow a chain of logic and at some point just say, well, this is crap. If you're following the chain of logic and the logic is good, well, then it can't be crap. It can't be absurd. And that to me would be very interesting. not that I want to follow things past absurdity and then implement them, but and one of the things that to me, and I may read this slightly differently than you, and it was a surprise to me, but I think it's a good observation by Kenneth, where he said where he somewhat hints that Aristoi are idiotic too. It's just that their idiocy is to constantly pursue rigorous self-criticism, to lead the examined life, to think about the big things, to push that rock up the hill, to hold the weight of the world on their shoulders. They are as obsessed by those things in expressing their personal nature as the Banasoi are in accumulating rooms full of gold, or the Duloi in satisfying their bodily whatever, food, drink, whatever gets them. And since we've mentioned, let's see, and lastly about Hegel, I wish Sharon was here, because reading and listening to Tim Snyder really changed my view on the dialectic nature of history. Because Snyder agrees somewhat with Hegel that history is dialectic. And you can see that dialectic, the working out of agency and contingency, retrospectively. But where he says that sort of thought went wrong is Marx and the science of history that says, well, we can apply this dialectical method to tell us what the future will be. And that's important because Lenin made the observation that, well, if we know how it's going to turn out, let's get on with it. We can kill them now. We don't have to wait for them to die out. We can effect that dying out. And so I think Hegel doesn't address the future. I think that's a sort of a misuse of Hegel, the dialectical method. It helps one to understand the past, but it doesn't say, oh, and the actions open to us in our agency now, and the contingencies that might be out there that are unknown. Well, no, they're not unknown. We can know them, so we'll know what that next step, that next collision of agency and contingency are going to be. Is just a delusion. It's a Banausic delusion of being in control, as opposed to the, as I said a little bit about it last week or the week before, is that's why courage is a virtue. The future is unknown. If soothsaying and whatever, if that was a real science, well, hell, why would they waste time doing fortunes? Hell, they'd be buying wine presses like Thales, in order to get rich, or whatever, Anyway, or going into the past with their book of all the winning lottery numbers, so you can, in their sports almanac. Oh well, that's enough.
No, it's good. I mean, that issue of a misuse of the dialectic, I think, is right on, especially when you see it in terms of a failure to recognize the proper roles of agency and contingency. Effectively, what they're doing is they're trying to reduce contingency to being a mere adjunct to agency and say, you know, nothing will ever happen to surprise us. We can predict all the things that will happen, and then we won't be surprised. And then the cosmos will be all agency and no contingency. This is effectively what's happening when people claim that they've now worked out the future. And the flaw in that is the fundamental flaw that makes no sense to Noesis, but makes, you know, perfect sense to someone who digs into gnosis deeply enough. And that is, we are mortals. You know, the universe is not ours to command. The notion that contingency is not a major factor in our lives is just ego writing itself larger and larger. It's just trying to turn the whole universe into an extension of itself. All of this is mine. It will happen the way I want it to. And, you know, this is that thing about the role of emotions. You know, we have so many things we might be paying attention to. If it weren't for emotions, we'd pretty much get everything wrong all the time. But the emotions are the things that go, oh no, oh no, look, tiger, tiger, tiger. You know, it's like we need that ability for our emotions to go, shut up about your taxes and look at the tiger in the bushes or you're gonna die. You know, and that's how it needs to work. That's the level at which people need to respect contingency in their lives. You know, to say the moment at which I start to think things or say things or write things that make it sound like my ego really can control it all, there should be a, oh no, I see hubris. There's hubris in the bushes. It's going to eat you. That's effectively what the Spartans are trying to tell to, you know, to the Athenians after that battle early on in the Peloponnesian War. I know you had a great victory. Isn't it fun when we win? We love it, right? But I hear you suggesting that that was entirely because of your agency. We know this flaw. We've made this fallacy ourselves countless times, and it always ends in disaster. So, you know, one friend to another, why aren't your alarm bells going off? Why is it something in you going, oh no, hubris? I appear to be possessed by hubris. I'm having an enthusiasm. I think there's something wrong. And of course, the Athenians at that point are like, nah, it's all agency. We won because we're that good.
Oh, I wanted to say one other thing. You mentioned Hannah Arendt, and I'll never detract from Hannah Arendt or anything she's written. But it kind of in this area, Orwell's essay, Politics in the English Language, was given to me by one of my professors, not Kenneth, but it was like, read this, it'll change your view on language. You know, that language is obscures rather than clarifies and is intentionally used that way. It's a, you know, well, we don't have sophists today. We're moderns.
We don't have sophists because we wouldn't recognize one as being any different from the rest of us. we're all sophists. We don't understand. That's a vice, not a virtue. what do you mean you're not supposed to do that? We all do that. That's how you win. Isn't winning the good part? I need to win. Joe, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
I mean, a lot actually, since so much has been covered. I mean, in the sense that even that I've been here, it's like, I mean, I don't even necessarily know where to start. I mean, but I'll just say really quickly, without having read the essay, I'd imagine, you know, if it's something about the Western culture breaks things up into parts very, you know, and sometimes goes too far. And I think that that's probably where maybe the obscurity is probably, you know, it's becoming something where it becomes more confusing than actually clarifying the language itself. So that's pretty, I mean, I haven't read the essay, but it would be interesting because I think about that sometimes, how we, you know, go too far with categorization. And then once you go too far with that, it's like, well, wait a minute, doesn't apply all the time. It's kind of, it really becomes really contextual.
And so that becomes a lot more challenging, and when it becomes, you know, written down too. And anyway, that's just one aspect of it. So that's interesting in and of itself. But, you know, just thinking about it in terms of how the fundamental idea of, you know, coming back to this, and I appreciate the way you're approaching this, Rick, is the idea of ancient, medieval, and modern, and kind of looking at it from through those three lenses. And I look at you know, philosophy is very, very important at this particular moment in time, primarily because that it is meant just to do that, is overcome our bias. And since it's meant to overcome our bias, the idea that we have this full understanding of reality, and we may be fooled into that again to a certain degree. In the sense that I was just reading in this, how there is a, you know, risk with even digital twins. You know, this virtual reality, these models that can create and simulate things in ways that we never thought before, and allows us to manipulate things that like we never thought before. And even there was a story of in how the you know, basically it was this modeling that allowed the Apollo astronauts to actually enter back into orbit, you know, in order, once their oxygen tank actually blew up, and those models actually worked, and it was not necessarily a bad thing. But now these computational power has a way of us thinking that we've capture all the nuances of reality, and that we really are just fooling ourselves if that's what we believe. And there are limitations to the data and the sensory data that comes into us, just as there are a model. The same problems still exist. The problems don't go away. Now, I'm not saying these things aren't a hell of a lot more effective, you know, than human beings. That's not the argument that I'm not, but I'm saying is it's not absolute. So this idea that we, you know, somehow, and it's this fooling ourselves that, you know, that there's this, yeah, that we can come up with this absolute, you know, version of reality that allows us to make decisions that ultimately, I think, some of us might even think that they're ethical. And so, there's, and I really also, just to, you know, kind of, you know, there's a lot of other things I can go into here. And I did put a video in the chat that I think really captures well the linear type of thinking that you think you can have, or that you have, based off of just off of new discoveries, new techniques, new models of the world. It really is. I mean, and maybe I'll come back to it later, but without going on too long, because I think one of the main things that you just brought up was, I wasn't aware of Hannah Arendt's three versions of truth, as that you had just talked about. You know, the factual, the rational, and the artistic, and how there's these emotions, the empirical evidence, and the logic, and how, you know, all the fit together, and how we think about these ideas of truth. And when we use these different models to try to come up with a solution in each one of them, like as if, and this is what, so an example would be, I would think, and you tell me if I'm wrong, if you have an ideology, you're applying the same solution across all three. And that's where it goes horribly wrong, because you're not necessarily considering the nuances of each one of those truths. So I have the truth, it's absolute, and I got it. And then, you know what, it applies to all three of these areas. No, it doesn't. And then that's where the idea is kind of this contingency aspect that Nara was just talking about, you know, that, yeah, that it's all agency and not contingency. No, it's contingent. And it's contingent on these three things. And so it really is something, I think, where this is where we have to kind of, consider not only the limitations of ourselves, but how actually technology can accelerate a problem just as fast as it solves a problem. So anyway.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you. That essay, Truth and Politics, it's a real good read. And of course, the whole thing was motivated by the enormous pushback she got from the Jewish community after she wrote Eichmann in Jerusalem. And she said, I was sent there as a reporter to report on the trial, and I'm telling you what I saw. And what I saw was he did monstrous things without being a monster. He was a fairly boring person. He was concerned with whether he got enough promotions in his job. Was his excellence at doing his job recognized adequately by the powers that be? Was he efficient at it? And that he had, when it came to why he did the things he did, he was full of contradictions. One minute he'd be spouting some propaganda about Jews being inferior, and the next minute he'd talk about how he'd met some Jewish people and he really liked them and he had the greatest respect for the Jewish people. And you're like, wait, what? And she says, I know, right? I mean, his ideas were all over the place and self-contradictory, and he didn't much care why he did the things he did. He doesn't satisfy our picture of a hate-driven ideologue who was determined to exterminate, a race because he was boring. She said the only really noteworthy feature that he had was no imagination to speak of. He just sort of did conventional things. So he followed the rules. He, climbed the system and did what he could. And her conclusion was that that's all that's necessary to create a Holocaust. There's a bunch of people who mostly follow the rules and don't want to get in trouble. If you have a large number of, this is what Kenneth Smith calls useful idiots. If you have a large number of useful idiots that you can manipulate through their desire not to get in trouble, or by any other means that you can get a handle on them, then they act, Kenneth talks about this a lot, they act as a gigantic untapped pool of power and resources, just waiting for the first demagogue to come along and pick them off the ground and wield them. Kenneth's line is, he tries to take it a little further than Hannah Arendt. His line is, this is why useful idiots are an existential threat to the future of the human race. Because when people are allowed to live a passive, infantilized existence, they are tools. Whether anybody's using them right now or not, they have the moral level of a tool. They'll do anything under the right conditions. And in the world, there are people looking for tools like that. They're looking for lots and lots and lots of tools like that. They want them. They need them. They're searching for them. And it's like leaving an atom bomb just lying around at the park, or dynamite, or loaded handgun. He says this is not how you're supposed to deal with power. You're supposed to, keep power out of the hands of the people who want it the most. That's what you do with power. What you do is the nut jobs who really want to break the world or fill their appetites or carry out their ideologies, those people need to be denied power. And you can't do that if 2/3 of your population are just walking tools waiting to be wielded. And that's one of his critiques of what happened in the 1930s in Germany. Is the German culture had been for so long raising people to be obedient, not thinking about what the consequences are. It had too much faith in systems. The faith was, well, the law could never be changed to require people to participate in a Holocaust. That just couldn't happen. The people wouldn't vote for that. And the next thing you know, it happened, right? Contrary to the protection of it could never happen, it happened. And suddenly all these people became the trigger or the means of making it all happen. It's an example of ideology blinding us to the dangers right in front of our face. people who will do anything if the perverse incentives are aligned correctly are not moral people, and they're not safe to have lying around. So this is why the ancient Greeks were so obsessed with, they thought, and they could be wrong about this, they thought that nature just produces douloi and benousoi and potential aristoi, that nature likes the diversity and nature just makes these varieties of people, and that you're stuck with, you might be able to adjust your culture. If you work hard at it, you might be able to shift the numbers. And so Athens was proud of the fact they felt that they had 1/3 aristoi, 1/3 benousoi, 1/3 douloi. They held Sparta a bit in contempt because Sparta was like, I don't know, 99% helots and only 1% free Spartans. So they felt that you could move the numbers around, but they thought you couldn't just eliminate douloi and benousoi. There were always going to be a lot of douloi and benousoi. And so the important thing to do is to figure out how you could organize society to give douloi and benousoi something to do that will please them and keep them out of trouble at the same time. And that you want to organize your culture in such a way that if anybody has been miscategorized, you can find out about that and move them to where they belong. But also, if somebody's not static, but they could develop from one into another, then you want to create the opportunities for them to develop. Maybe someone actually is a doulos up until the point where they, grow dissatisfied with the doulic life, and they have the urge to benousify themselves. Maybe. I mean, we're dealing with a lot of unknowns here. We don't know. But that was what they thought their program should be. Of course, the modern version of that program is let's just exterminate all the bad people and then all the good people will inherit the world, right? That's a modern abstract category. We'll just pick up an eraser and erase this part of the chalkboard of life and everything will be great. Or the other modern version is there's no such thing as douloi, benousoi, and aristoi. There's only one model of person, and he's a robot, and his brain is a computer, and all you have to do is open up his head and pour in the good facts and close it, and now he's a good person, and that's how it works. And thus that's how we do our educational system. Just all we have to do is prove that we got the good facts in there, and now they should be good people, right? That's how it should turn out. It's just, it's fascinating. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, something that you hit on that was really, I think, kind of key is this idea of how objects, and we're using tools.
Yes.
And, how in nature, if you look at it in that term, it's not natural to use someone else as a tool.
Right.
Right. So, that's where some of these things is that all of a sudden you're looking for an answer and you just think that, well, I just need to do X, Y, and Z, and then you compromise on that. And when you compromise on that, you're compromising, you're working against harmony and working as opposed to in rhythm with it. So it's how we treat, essentially people and objects and as objects, not relationships.
Yeah.
And that problem is a, kind of relationship with nature or relationship between two people or, anyway, within nature itself. That really is it's a real big issue because I think that's when we lose sight of what is actually truly meaningful, and we look at the system as being more meaningful than actually nature itself. And so that's the hubris that we fall to, is that it becomes exploitive, and you end up with the same system you started with. You're just getting there a different way.
Right. Or what a lot of people do is when they're dissatisfied by the abuse that they've taken from the system, their response is, I want to be the abuser. If I'm the abuser, then I won't suffer the abuse anymore. And that's the level of morality they've managed to raise themselves up to. I want to be the one punching other people in the face. And, you can understand how they got there, but you're not going to build a civilization that way. I mean, that's just David likes to talk about Kenneth Smith occasionally bursting out in frustration and contempt at some of the questions people ask, like, what is the practical use of philosophy? How can philosophy justify itself so that we should bother to spend one moment on it? And as David points out, Kenneth's response is that question itself proves that you're a barbarian. You don't have any civilization. This question is meaningless. Every part of it is meaningless. You don't understand yourself. You don't understand your world. You don't know anything. There's no point in answering this question. It's a question posed by a thug. You know, so tell me about that smart guy stuff. I'm gonna get me one of them smart guys. Yeah, it'll make me some bucks. This is the level of discourse we too often have about this stuff. It's creepy. But yeah, seeing other people as not just that other people make themselves into tools, useful idiots, which is dangerous, but the fact that there are predators walking around looking for those.
Right.
And because they look for those, they become the man with the hammer. And you might not be a useful idiot. You might not be a tool, but he can't tell the difference. He's still going to look at you and go, behold, my tool. I just need to pick him up and wield him. Because, you know,
Right.
he can't see the person. He can only see the utility value. So, you know, what's this paragraph talking about in section H? It's saying people like that they can't govern. They can say that what they're doing is governing, and other people can believe that what they're doing is governing, but literally nothing they do counts as governance. It's only by destroying the meaning of the term govern that you can then say honestly that they're governing, because now governing has been reduced to, haha, who's got his hand on the lever now? I do. Therefore, I'm governing. It's like, no, you're abusing is what you're doing.
And really, just one last point to what you just said exactly. I mean, that's essentially only seeing, seeing everything as a nail, or basically as something to be utilized. That's where you start to remove the contingency. You think you're actually going to be doing a good thing, and it's like, well, no, that's not what that's not the objective. Anyway, but thanks for that.
Thanks, Joe. Steven, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
I suppose something to be observed. When we're talking about the Western world, it can be split between the Anglo-Saxons and the Continentals as a sort of basic category. Of course, we know all categories have their weaknesses, but looking in the Anglo-Saxon world now, it's been very successful for a few centuries, and they've assumed that can only because everything that Anglo-Saxons believe in must be the greatest form of knowledge which has ever existed. Luck or good fortune had nothing to do with it. And I tend to notice in the Anglo-Saxon world, well, look what happened. World War One, the Anglo-Saxons won, so everyone thought, oh, we've got to be like the Anglo-Saxons, we'll try to be democracies, and they either all turned Soviets or fascists very soon, the Continentals. But then World War II came and the vast Anglo-Saxon correction again, and they figured they could turn the whole world into a democracy because, hey, democracy is inherently virtuous. Failing to read your history of the great democratic state of the Aegean was the biggest terrorist of the Aegean, but we won't observe that. But a lot of people who are working for government now, a lot of politicians are professionals. They've come straight out of university. They've not really seen any other type of life. They go from university, an ideological haven, and they try to practice that pure ideology inside their government offices, avoiding normal reality as much as possible. I was sitting in a philosophy meeting, most of the people are people that work for the government, they were all intellectuals, and I was trying to tell them that you don't really understand blue collar workers. They're offended, and one guy goes, oh, I had some I was telling a few blue collar workers what to do for 5 minutes one day. I understand them. And yeah, you have these professional politicians now. They've gone to university, they've studied something, and now they're professional politicians. But there's a problem there. It's like one French philosopher was pointing out, he's gone around and talked to various political leaders throughout the Western world, and you're not finding classical educations anymore. Like, none of them know anything about history. And, you know, the ancient Greek philosopher said, well, there's the education for the masters, which was the classical liberal education, and the education for the slaves. And what he discovered was that the modern Western politician hasn't studied the classics. They've studied business school, office politics, all the Banausize stuff. Even Kennedy, not that I'm saying I'm agreeing with JFK's politics, but he had a classical background. He majored in history and literature. And when a serious crisis arose, he handled it relatively well. And this seems to be lost on a lot of people, that now our government departments in the Western world are full of ideologues who've had a slaves training, a Banausize training in business school. And I think they can apply all that to the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I mean, I certainly saw that in the VA. You know, when I was first working in the VA as a national programmer, there were only 6 people between me and the President of the United States. That was the chain of authority. And I knew them all. I knew every one of them all the way up. As of 10 years ago, there were 14 levels of management between a national VA programmer and the president. What are all those people doing? They'll tell you they're making it all safe, but being professional, raising the standards. But they're actually all ideologues. Almost every one of them is an ideologue. And they think that their job is to make sure that nobody in government tries to solve any problems. And they don't want anyone in government solving problems, because if it goes wrong, those managers will be at risk. They might have to stick their neck out, take a risk trying to solve something. And they don't want that. Business school teaches them not to do that. What they've learned how to do is to outsource everything. Because when you're outsourcing things, they'll tell you it's because of the efficiencies of the market, but when you get them in private conversations, they don't believe that. The reason they're outsourcing it is they're outsourcing the risk. It's not my fault. It was the contractor. Oh, well, then it's okay. It's okay that you screwed over veterans as long as you did it through contracting and not by trying to do something yourself. So VA's got all these people who have decades of experience in writing medical informatics software. And they have these piles of managers whose whole job is to make sure that the head of the VA never gets exposed to the idea that, the VA could fix its own problems. They could actually make the software take care of veterans. He has to be absolutely kept away from that idea. And he has to be fed a constant diet of, you have to outsource the risk, you have to outsource the risk, you have to outsource the risk. And so now they're in a situation where the VA, the United States Department of Veterans Affairs, is squandering billions of dollars trying to replace their homegrown medical software system. And they keep failing because, of course.
Jim Kirk's eulogy out of Star Trek. Risk is our business.
Risk is our business. Yeah, that's right. Acting in the world, being a good person, you can't avoid risk. You have to directly confront that there's a certain, irreducible amount of risk required to try things. Science is based on risk. You have to risk being publicly wrong. And if you're not willing to risk being publicly wrong, you're a liar. You're somebody who wants to never get caught in a mistake.
Stay safe, Rick.
That's right. Safety, safely, low risk. Anyway, I'm with you. It's crazy. Piles and piles of ideologues, and they're all just acting out what they were taught. in college. This is what they learn in business school. This is how the world works. And the fact that they keep failing over and over in no way dissuades them from using the exact same strategy tomorrow that failed today. They can't be, they know that it works. There must be some detail somewhere that has to be fiddled with. But otherwise, stick with the plan, stick with the plan, stick. That iceberg is no match for the Titanic. Stick with the full speed ahead. Stick with the plan. This is totally going to work. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I wonder whether there's not a relationship between, I guess, being and distance. It seems to me the Greeks were talking about philosophy as a love of wisdom, not a love of knowledge as such, because they probably realized that knowledge is limited and we have to work within wisdom itself. And so their emphasis is in the relationship of the self to the social structure. Of course, there's always externals that you have to deal with. They impinge upon you too, such as nature and other civilizations and so forth. And so that's important to have some relationship with the externality in some sense. But it seems to me, at least in the Greeks, as far as I understand it, there's really a pretty sharp division between terrestrial and celestial relationships. I mean, celestial as to the realms of the gods in a way is like the further they're not manageable in a way. So it's much more localized in terms of the terrestrial existence. Even the externals are that way. I wonder at what point did that switch became a love of wisdom for the love of knowledge. It seems to me like as we move into sort of like toward the modern age, we begin to realize there is a more intimate relationship between the heavenly bodies, particularly the sun and the moon, and our relationship to the terrestrial. So maybe that should be pulled into the terrestrial being in a way. And so that slowly expanded in a sense. The wisdom is like expanded in a sense of dealing with knowledge. So knowledge became a more fundamental part. I recently saw a video. It was not very successful. I announced it to another group. The James Webb Telescope, of course, is a highly instrumental mechanical device. Discover that there was something before. There was planets and stars and stuff before the Big Bang. At least the instrument says so. So that could be the instruments wrong. If it's not that, then in a sense, our whole knowledge of the structure of the universe is wrong, because how could there be something before the origins to the Big Bang? So maybe we have to revise our whole system of knowledge, okay? Or is it possible, has been suggested, there's something about our relationship to knowledge is in a sense constrained, in the sense that it really is true that space and time is our figment of our imagination, our way of perceiving the world, and it takes a different form altogether. And so therefore we saw that there was a beginning of time, but when there really isn't, because time operates in a completely different way than we existed. So there's might not be a beginning, a middle, and an end so much. So in that sense, I wonder what this whole trying to understand beyond the boundaries of the terrestrial actually affects our lives. And you might say, well, you know, the asteroid did destroy the dinosaurs. But when you expand it, it seems to me the solar system is not only the movement of planets, but it's really got to do with the the radiation of the sun in the heliosphere. And of course, Voyager 2 has gone into the past the heliopause and see things are completely different in a different way. So maybe we are just living not only in the Earth bubble, but the heliosphere bubble. That's really, even in outer boundaries of what affects us as a relationship between the real and the actually exists. And the Big Bang is outside. You can say, well, there's gravity waves. We detected that, but how does the gravity waves affect us? I don't know. Exploding supernova might affect us, but so I just wonder whether we have stretched our imagination into things that, in effect, is very distant to our lives. But I must admit, I'm interested in that stuff, but I'm not interested in existential way. So, okay. So in some sense, I'm interested that they are experimenting that, but is that more important in the relationship of a social structure? I don't know. You know, I mean, I think it's important to have that, but I think what really affects us, our life, is the social structure, our relationship to our society, and then our relationship to the world, others, and the relationship to plants and animals and stuff like that. But to say, well, whether we're going to argue about the Big Bang, how they work, whether there was something before the Big Bang, or whether that there was nothing, like, that's nice to know, but I'm not sure my life depends on it. So I wonder whether, and when you add in the thing that now we have the effect of insurance as a concept, the tension between insurance and sort of like a risk, we manage that. So we create a distance within the structure itself, in some sense. So that's kind of interesting. We reversed it. We're interested in the Big Bang, which is very far away, but but we don't want to take any risk. That's why we have. Plus, I have insurance, so I can't say like all these other people are not taking risks. Neither am I. So how does that work? The relationship between what is imminent and what is distant? How does it truly affect our lives,
Right.
in that sense? That's it. It's a funny question, but distance seems to have something to do with it.
Yes. But not a question we'll be able to answer today. I'm going to gradually steer us back to the text because I haven't actually taken us through any of the text today. We've been talking around the text. We had some new folks on early on, and I felt a need to explain some of the background for them. But they've all left now, so we can return to the text, but only after Joe gets his say. Come off mute, Joe. Tell us what's on your mind.
So I'll try and bring us back to the text in this kind of roundabout way. Is that when I looked at the first few things is about the idea of how any human can be slavish in the sense of being pathetically addicted to their own appetites, dogmas, or prejudices. Right. So any human, and I think that's a really key point, because the reality is that whether we were just talking a moment ago about whether Stephen mentioned the idea of blue collar and workers and university professors, or whatever it may be, university education, whatever. And that's, I think, the point of that quote is that anybody can be addicted to their bias, their dogmas, their beliefs, right? So I don't necessarily think it's about a particular experience. I mean, there are things that we can say that universities are separated from the real world, but yet some of the most innovative technology has been taken out of the universities, brought into the world, objects like meaning semiconductor, everything. I mean, computers. So some of the research that actually has produced things in this world that lot of the commercialization practices are being done with the universities, and that's one of the complaints about them, actually, is that they become too commercialized. And yeah, and nobody's going to understand, I think, someone else's experience, the blue collar worker or whomever it may be. And but this is precisely as to why I think philosophy is so important, is because it transcends those boundaries and actually asks us about what it is to me, what does it mean to live a good life? What does it mean to be human? And what it means to be human is it's not like, what does it mean to be human if you are on an assembly line? It doesn't mean, what does it mean to be human if you are, I don't know, in your postdoc? It means, what does it mean to be human? So that this idea, that bias, that experience that we have can be transcended in a way. And that transcendence is by understanding our limitations. And our limitations come in every shape and form in every aspect of life. And I think that that's where, so in a sense, it's what Kenneth is saying here, by using just saying any human, is a really important point, because it's not just our personal perspectives, because those we've already established are limited. Thus, and I would argue that every layer of abstraction away from nature puts us in a greater danger of actually forgetting that. So if we're on an assembly line in a box and we think that this is the perspective on reality, and I'm a blue collar worker, quote unquote, well, that may be outside of harmony in nature, as well as the individual that doesn't necessarily understand the experience of what it's like to be on the assembly line. Therefore, you appeal to higher level ideals in order to kind of make things work. And higher level ideals, meaning that limits and boundaries of our own personal perspectives on reality. Anyway, so I tried to bring it back to the text to some degree. But I think that that's a good example, is that I spoke a moment ago with what, when it came to language and the overcategorization, that is, I think, a form of overcategorization, is to say, that sectors, so to speak, have, this, I don't know, mandate on the human condition. I don't know how to express it. So anyway, that's just a thought.
Yeah, appreciate it, Joe. Thanks. Good discussion. So let's do a little text. We got 20 minutes. We can make our way through. I think we can get through this paragraph, actually. And I'm not going to do the first few sentences. We've done them several times from different angles. I'm going to start us with partway through this. After the sentence about why do lawyers slaves, and of course, as you recall, we said Kenneth is also implying a similar sentence should follow this that says Banausoi are also slaves in such ways and for such reasons as militate against their fully grasping why they're slaves. That is, what prerequisites of free citizenry and philosophical individuality they lack by nature. And it's worth, before we go on to the next sentence, it's worth saying that one of the ways in which they misunderstand it is that if you try to suggest to a doulos that free citizenry and philosophical individuality require certain things, they might just say, "Nuh-uh, I'm already free. And I already know as much as I need to. So I've just disproven you. My experience disproves your contention that there are requirements. If there were requirements, I would know it. It's like for all my life, up until about 2000 and something, I forget when, one of the early 2000s, I knew I didn't have any allergies. I knew it. I mean, I'd never noticed any allergies, so I didn't have any. And of course, it turned out I had piles of allergies. That was why I had bronchitis all the goddamn time. My lungs were constantly in revolt against all these things I was allergic to that I was relentlessly eating and exposing myself to. And at exactly the same time that was true, I knew it wasn't true. And how did I know it wasn't true? Because I knew it. I didn't have any experience of self-identifying as somebody who has allergies. I'd never thought of myself that way. Therefore, I didn't. You know, my parochial experience wasn't broad enough to include such paltry things as testing to find out whether I have an allergy, right? And I never connected the dots that there could be a relationship between all my coughing all the time and, you know, maybe I should stop drinking milk. And despite the fact that I knew my dad was allergic to milk, I mean, he had asthma. He'd get asthma attacks if he drank milk. I knew that, but I'd somehow decided that I was invulnerable to it. And the way that I knew was, well, it was my opinion. You know, it was the first time I got tested, and 40 some odd things light up as food sensitivities. I'm like, oh my God. I remove those things from my life and I start coughing about half as often. I'm like, whoa, I guess my idea of myself and my life was bullshit. But until that moment, I knew that I was right. And that's the level at which a doulos knows that they don't lack any prerequisites of free citizenry, right? I mean, they want things. Everybody else wants things. They should have a say. One man, one vote. It's obvious. And the same is true of philosophical individuality. They're like, what? I'm a person. You can't say that I'm not an individual person. Look, here I am. And the idea that they might be walking, talking appetites who are barely distinguishable from other walking, talking appetites, this is outside their range of possibilities. They don't know what it is that they could be missing that could be important enough to account for, because it falls in one of the blind spots of being a doulos. And for Banausoi, they'd have a different kind of revolt. Okay, if there are prerequisites for free citizenry, how do I get me some of that? So, do I buy them? I buy them, right? Or maybe there's a class I have to take and I have to get a certificate. Show me the system by which I acquire the claim that I have those prerequisites, and ipso facto, I will have the prerequisites. Actually, give me a moment with a ballpoint pen. I'll just write myself up a certificate. There, I've got a certificate. Now gimme, right? You game the system. The Banausos doesn't self-identify this way, but acts this way. When you believe that systems are what make things go, there are two possible ways to deal with being told that you can't have something. And one of them is, which part of this system do I have to tug on in order to get the cookie? I'll just go tug on that and I'll buy myself a legislator or something. Or if that fails, I'll just take over the system and change the requirements. Now the requirements are exactly right for me. Everyone now has to say that I have free citizenry and philosophical individuality because the system said so. And that makes it real to a Banausos. If the system says it, it's real, even if I had to change the system to make it say that. There is, as Nietzsche observes, a nihilism at work in this kind of ultra left brain, hyper-noetic mindset. Whatever the notion of garbage in, garbage out, which every computer programmer knows, the Banausos doesn't acknowledge. Look, I don't know what to tell you, man. The system says that I got to vote, so I got to vote. The system says I'm president. What can I do? I'm president. That's just how it goes. It can't possibly, the system can't be wrong. The logic can't be wrong. The math can't be wrong. The law can't be wrong. Or if it is, we'll just change it so it's right, so it's always right, so that I get what I want. Both of these approaches, the nuh-uh approach and the, well, let me get my hands on it and I'll corrupt it and make it do what I want approach, you can see how both of these militate against the kind of self-introspection that's required to grow and develop as a person. It's easier to just corrupt the system than to become a better person, right? And it's easier to just deny that your appetites are a problem. So, you know, you were talking earlier about part of what we have to do is acknowledge that we have these, we all have these liabilities. We're born into them. The temptation to become dualic, the temptation to become banausic, those are siren songs in us every bit as strong as the alcoholic's desire for the bottle. I was born with that desire for the bottle. Never have to have spent any time in the bottle, and it doesn't change the fact. That level of inevitability is also the case for all of us when it comes to the desire to just live an authentic experiential life, live for the day. We've all heard that call. Who doesn't want to have a directly, immediately rewarding, authentic life? I mean, part of us remembers that from our childhood. For all that we poo-poo it and push off against it and try to be adults, part of us still longs for the immediacy of being plugged into life. There's part of it that just felt amazing. And every so often we get a little whiff of it, and then we want it back. And the same is true for the systematized intellectual life. I mean, anybody who's ever read a Sherlock Holmes story and identified with Holmes for a moment has felt that desire of, I can just think my way to the truth. I can just strategize my way to success. If you read Little Orphan Annie, it's all about how the only thing holding people back is, you know, gumption and you know, you just got to try, and you got to want it, and you got to be smart and make it happen. She can lift herself from poverty to wealth in the course of 3 pages of a comic strip. And it's like, nobody ever thought before of selling lemonade. Really? Nobody? And every single person who walks by wants to buy your lemonade, and suddenly you have piles of money. Is that how the market works? Not in my experience, not in anybody's experience. But the systematizing part of our brain wants it to be true. It should be true. You should be able to it should be a meritocracy. You should be able to be smart and clever and educated and organized enough to systematically, you know, succeed in the world. It shouldn't be hopeless. And all you have to do to understand a doulos or a banausos is that's somebody who capitulates to one or the other of those urges to feel that way and live that way. And when you see it, and you see what's at stake for the person psychologically and characterologically, why they need that addiction, you can see why reading an essay about, you know, arete and ethos and anthropoculture is not going to dissuade them in the slightest from living the life exactly the way that they live it now. They're incapable, not from an absence, but from a presence of a burning, driving need that doesn't leave any room for, I wonder if this is all bullshit. I wonder if I'm wrong. I wonder if I'm an addict. They can't think those thoughts. They need to not think those thoughts. Feels too good to do what they're doing now, despite all the problems that they're having. And it feels too bad. As I can't remember who it was on this call earlier. It might have been Donald, who said there is an enormous amount of discomfort associated with the heuristic way of life. You know, even if somebody's momentarily persuaded that maybe I should try something different, when they get it, if they don't have the heuristic drive in them to compensate for, the first time they try it and the boulder rolls over them and breaks their leg, they're gonna be like, fuck this. I am absolutely not rolling this boulder up this hill. This is a stupid waste of time. Right? I mean, it's not an accident that people don't pursue the heuristic way of life. It is as script writers will say, it is massively overdetermined. You have piled on the motivations on these people over and over and over to do what they're doing and to not do what I think they should be doing. And at this point, there's nothing I can do that's going to overcome all of those perverse incentives pushing with such amazing power to drive them in that direction. And that is precisely the same energy that goes into making a blind spot out of the possibility that their way of life might make them incompetent to govern, might make them incompetent to understand themselves. If they don't understand themselves, none of the choices they make are free, right? They're just acting out their impulses or their ideologies. And thus they can't be an individual. They're not really a person yet. They're like a proto-person who's stuck in the process of development and never got far enough. That's what he's talking about here, you know, in these sentences. He's saying, this is how the ancients saw the development of these character types. They're like, it would be like letting, you know, if if infants who couldn't walk nevertheless had speech and rhetoric, right? And an idea about who they were, it would be like letting them vote. It's like, I'm sorry, sweetie, you are not a person yet. You're still only a little bit removed from a blob of jelly. You have more growing to do. Keep growing. It comes up in Kobudo class all the time. You get brand new students into Kobudo, and the first thing they want to pick up is the nunchaku because they've seen a Bruce Lee movie. And you're like, oh no, if you've been watching the Bruce Lee movies, you would have seen the one where the guy who's incompetent picks up a nunchaku and thinks he's going to fight Bruce Lee with it. And Bruce Lee just smiles and goes, does the equivalent of going boo. And the guy whips out the nunchaku and hits himself in the head with it, because that's what they do. They rebound on you. They ricochet. You do not know what you're doing. The easiest thing in the world is to knock yourself out with your own weapon. It's like, okay, day one, no nunchakus. You're not getting anywhere near that. I know you want it, but you should not pick that up because you don't understand the consequences of your actions. And the nunchaku is all about the consequences of your actions more than the other tools. Your own actions are going to hurt you if you're not very, very careful. This is how the Greeks felt about politics. No, they had corrupt reasons to think it too, but the corrupt motivations were mixed side by side with legitimate motivations in a melange that moderns find unsatisfying because we don't know whether to praise them or demonize them. And of course, what we ought to be doing is a more complicated thing than that. So Joe, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, just really quickly, as far as this idea of maybe how these tweaks to the systems actually can sometimes lead to fooling ourselves. You know, I was when I first started out working one place. There was a very, you know, I won't go into too much detail, but there was a very big program where initially they've been asking for a lot of money. They finally got it, right? And I mean, they were getting a lot. And then like they realized, oh, wait a minute, this isn't working the way we thought it would, which is fine. You know, that's fine if you're honest and intellectually honest and just saying, okay, look, you know, we got it wrong. But instead what they did is they kept rebaselining.
Yeah.
They kept tweaking the system as like, well, look, we're performing amazing.
Yeah.
And then everybody in there, it was like we're getting promoted at the same time. And they thought, hey, look, you know, we're doing great. And it's like, I mean, at some point, I mean, and it ended up blowing up in their face to a certain degree, but there was a whole hierarchy that was created essentially because not everybody was kind of pushed out as a result of it blowing up, but and it was just a question of you know, people thinking they just had to tweak the system a little bit in order to be right, and actually they would have their new, you know, that this made them right. And anyway, there was just something that had come up to me that and I thought about this, and I still think it's a great quote. It's yeah, it's by somebody who has, you know, pretty religious bent, but was G.K. Chesterton when he was responding to what's wrong with the world and to a newspaper article, and you know, he just wrote back and said, I am. And it was absolutely brilliant. It's like, yeah, yes. I am. And so, but that gets to the main point that you're making, right? It's the lack of introspection.
Right.
It's the lack of looking in as saying, and that is truly the only thing that you actually control. That is it. You can look inside yourself and say, what is it that, you know, is about me that's contributing to this problem, as opposed to, well, it's the system. I just need to tweak a couple things here and there, as opposed to actually my perception being completely distorted.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it was, I mean, I don't know if that story was actually exactly true, but that's what it, you know, it's been relayed to me. Yeah. And either way, it's a great story. I mean, I don't care if it is true or not, because it gets to the heart of what we're talking about. Like, somebody should write in and say, when a newspaper says, what's wrong with the world today? Well, you know, it's me. It's just, it's that simple.
Yeah.
Anyway, it is, I think it's a really important point to think that, then, this idea is that I just have to tweak the external
Right.
to fit my perspective on the world, as opposed to actually look at myself.
That's right.
That's the point. And as anything else, I just need to re-baseline the project. And the project is really going to work then. No, it's not. And so
Yes.
it's as simple as that. Anyway.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Joe. Yeah, Ginny sometimes laughs and says, everything would be better if Rick would be appointed president. And every single time I'm like, absolutely not. The position of president is not a good position. No matter who you put there, their flaws are going to be magnified to a massive scale. And we've all got flaws. I'm just going to dish out a different set of problems than the previous guy.
Yeah, but I'll choose your problems over the others. So that's where we are right now.
You say that because you haven't had to live with my problems.
So, I'm just saying it is relative too. There are some problems, sometimes you got to be thankful for what you have.
Yeah. Thanks, Joe. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
First of all, Rick, a philosopher king never wants to be a philosopher king.
No,
it has to be.
Words is precious.
Let me say something that might be a bearing on this. I wonder whether the structure itself does not engender its own property of emerging properties that come out of it, in this sense. I remember in the 1970s, I saw this movie called Circle of Deceit. It is about Beirut. And I remember there was a lot of deceit going on because it was led up to a kind of civil war. And I remember toward the end of the movie, there was these two guys. They were looking at the kids playing, and they all had guns, fighting with guns. And one of the guys says, "We don't have a chance." Okay. In other words, the deceit had happened, and it's going to merge itself in its own birth of greater circles of deceit. And if you look back at it, actually, how did the deceit originate? It was a neo-colonial situation, because Beirut was the, quote, the Paris of France. I mean, the Paris of the Middle East. Okay, it was a very beautiful city, very vibrant city. And the way that the French left it, because post-colonialism means they have to leave in some ways, and they divided the country in such a way to make sure that there was going to be a conflict in the various different sects between, I think, the Sunni and what's the other sect, and then Christians. There was going to be tension in the structure itself. So this was emerged to begin with as the post-colonial situation, which was, in some sense, in relation to the Lebanon, and Beirut was the capital, that it was going to emerge into conflict. So that's the beginning of the structure. And that emerged then, in a sense, this struggle in which circle of deceit happened, which in a sense engendered a greater civil war, because the kids were already learning this is what existence is about. So that was very interesting, that you could see that, in a sense, the structure has its own life. It produces its own life. And the people in it, and the raised in it, begin to adapt that structure and propel it into a greater. And now Beirut is just a horrible mess because we have set up the structure, not us. And we all love France, but France has not done some bad things, And so this is really set up to fail, because they want to be able to come in and help police the situation. So that was very. I was just impressed by that statement. It says, we don't have a chance. you already know the fate because the kids were brought up in that structure. That's
gonna
it, Phil.
I'm going to watch it this week. Thank you, Phil. That's a great recommendation. I've heard of it before. It's one I'm sorry that I've missed, but we're going to fix that. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
This one's for Joe, but it's for all of you, actually. Reading a lot of history, not that I'm a great expert, a thing most people are unaware of is we're all aware that, you know, Plato created the academies, and academies spread all over the Greco-Roman world, and they're going really hot for centuries. But by the 2nd century, when you started to see a more dictatorial turn in the former Greek states, the parts of the Greek Empire and the Romans, they had learned that these academies were troublemakers. For example, the academy around the Great Library. Well, they fought against a guy, one of the Ptolemies, and he got back into power, and boy, did he fix up the great librarians. He stitched them up quite nicely. And I suspect, and people don't know this, through the glory days of the Roman Empire, the academies were suppressed. Now, when Seneca apologizes for philosophy, he's not just doing that without that precedent, because he knows what happens to philosophers. And I suspect that this is going to be a history that's going to repeat. Give it so many decades, give it another century, give it the time when democracy's gone out the window finally in the Western world. And you have a dictator there who's dealing with the problem that he's got many fractures in society fighting against each other, which is what we're going into now. And he's going to look at the universities, and he's going to look at the professors and see where a lot of the trouble is coming from. He's going to send the guys in with the bayonets. So collect the professors and show them the front gate of their universities. This is like 90% possibility. You've got to remember that knowledge turns static during the period of the Roman Empire. Very little technological advancement occurred because they saw ideas as dangerous. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. And with that, we'll wrap up for this week. We'll pick this up again next week. And
Don't you have a closing remark? Come on.
you want a
Some
closing remark?
inspiration.
I'll give you a closing remark, and it's right from the text. I'm just going to quote Kenneth Smith. Philosophical virtuosity is required for anyone to be able to diagnose the concrete evidence of subjective and perspectival limitations. That is, we can be looking right at the consequences of our limits and not see it unless we get the philosophical.
I want that in writing.
There it is. Even though this evidence can be seen, its significance cannot be apparent to just any and every mind. Not all are fit to be parents, doctors, judges, or presidents. And indeed, and this is the critical part, the worst instances of incompetence are those furthest from being able to appreciate their own deficiency. This is the problem we have in Homo sapiens. We can't tell when we're pointing the wrong direction. We lack sophrosune. This is to rephrase what Kenneth wrote here. The ancient Greek perspective is our problem is that we lack sophrosune. We don't know which way we're pointing. We could be convinced that we're the best possible at being a physicist, when actually we shouldn't be allowed anywhere near a laboratory.
Hey, Rick, that was a great remark, because I'm studying with a group of Plato's Republic, and there's a guy that asserts it's not about the Republic, it's about teaching people how to think as philosophers.
Right.
That's a real purpose of the Republic, to develop the intellect, in a sense, to be able to criticize a society rather than he's rebuilding a society. So that was interesting. Yeah. I'm not sure if I buy that, but it sort of reflects what you're saying.
It's an interesting perspective. And if we remember, the next week we can see what Donald's opinion of that is. since he's well familiar with the Republic. But for now, we're going to hang up and say goodbye and have a great week.
Bye, Rick. Bye, Phil.
Bye. Take care, everyone.
Take care, everyone. See you, Donald.
Bye, Joe.